The lanterns didn't just light Victorian London, they watched it rot. On certain nights, the fog hanging low across the streets carried something wrong inside it. Not smoke, not coal, but a sweetness that didn't belong in the air. A sharp, invisible poison hiding behind perfume and progress. Ether. It was called a miracle, a triumph of modern science. But London learned, too late, that miracles can mutate. It slipped through keyholes and under doors, into sick rooms and schools, bedsides and cellar dens, a drug that promised relief and delivered disappearance, not just of pain but of will, of memory, of self. By candlelight, glass bottles whispered across tables, laughter turned thin, eyes glassed over, and the city began to change. Children drifted, mothers vanished into numbness, surgeons lost their hands, clerks lost their names. London didn't explode. It unraveled. Slowly, quietly, one breath at a time. Tonight, you're not just hearing a story about a substance. You're stepping into the moment a chemical did what no riot ever could. It shattered Victorian society from the inside. And once you see how it happened, you'll never look at progress the same way again. Subscribe and stay with me. The fog runs deep tonight, and the echoes of those ether-soaked streets still linger if you listen closely. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Even now, the past drifts nearer with every breath. The lamplight wavered first, a thin, trembling glow pressed against the soot-dark glass of the surgeon's window, turning the drifting fog outside into something almost liquid. It moved slowly along the panes, as if unsure whether it wanted to enter or retreat, hesitating at the threshold of a room where silence sat heavily upon polished brass and cold steel. Inside, the scent came next, faint at first, a thin ribbon of sweetness curling through the cracks, gentle enough to be mistaken for a misplaced perfume. But it was not perfume. It was ether. It clung to the air like a sigh held too long. The bottle stood open on the small wooden table, its blue label catching the lamplight as if winking at the world. A young assistant, hardly more than a boy, felt his pulse quicken each time the scent reached him. He had been sweeping the floor moments earlier, brushing away flecks of dried blood left from an earlier operation, but now his hands slowed, almost unconsciously. The aroma seemed to blur the edges of the world. The lamp glowed softer. The shadows stretched longer. His broom made a lazy arc across the boards, as though time itself had loosened its grip. The surgeon, Dr. Aldrich Wainwright, noticed the shift even before the boy did. He had felt it many times, ether drifting into the senses, softening sharpness, turning fear into something pliable. He did not look up immediately, but continued arranging his tools with mechanical precision. He had long ago learned that any hesitation, no matter how slight, could be misread by those watching. The public placed their trust in him, in these instruments, in the miracle that ether promised, a miracle wrapped in sweetness. He finally raised his eyes. The boy froze under the weight of his gaze, embarrassed by his own drifting mind. "Careful," Wainwright murmured, though his voice was not unkind. "The bottle is uncorked." The boy nodded, swallowing hard. He knew the stories. Everyone did. Ether had swept through the medical world like a revelation, its promise of painless cutting whispered with awe in lecture halls and operating theatres. But the stories that travelled through the poorer districts of London were different. Stories of workers inhaling too deeply, of servants fainting with smiles frozen on their lips, of children accidentally slipping into sleep too deep and too long. The scent thickened in the room. The patient waited on the table, still conscious but trembling, watching the lamplight flicker on the metal blade that would soon open his flesh. The surgeon approached him quietly, steady hands and steady breath masking the truth. He, too, felt the lure of that sweetness creeping around the edges of thought. Ether did not discriminate. Gentlemen, labourers, mothers, surgeons. Anyone who inhaled its promise found themselves momentarily lifted above pain, fear, even memory. "Breathe slowly," Wainwright instructed, lowering the saturated cloth toward the man's face. "Let it drift through you." The man obeyed, and the transformation was immediate. His trembling eased. His eyelids fluttered. A soft laugh escaped him, soft, airy, almost childlike, as the cloth pressed closer and the lamplight shimmered in his dimming eyes. Then his body slackened, falling into that uncanny stillness that frightened Wainwright each time he witnessed it. The line between relief and danger was thin, too thin, and yet society embraced this chemical as if it were a gift from the heavens. The boy moved closer, drawn by curiosity more than duty. The scent surrounded him fully now, warm and sweet as it clung to his lungs. He had never tasted anything like it. Neither the harsh reek of spirits nor the biting sting of laudanum could compare. This drifted gently, seducing the senses without warning. Outside, a carriage rolled past, its wheels hissing over damp cobblestones. The fog parted momentarily, revealing the faint silhouettes of passers-by, unaware of the quiet revolution unfolding behind the surgeon's glass. Soon, ether would leave the confines of rooms like this one. It would slip into drawing rooms, warehouses, ballrooms, basements. It would become more than a medical marvel. It would become an escape. But tonight, in this small chamber lit by a trembling lamp, the story had only just begun. Dr. Wainwright inhaled carefully, just a little, unintentionally, before the operation began, and in that single breath, something shifted inside him, too subtle for him to name. The sweetness settled into the room like a living thing, patient and knowing. London was about to change. The bell above the apothecary door gave a thin, uncertain chime, one of those sounds that seemed ashamed to echo in the quiet morning. The shop on Fleet Street was narrow, its windows fogged from within by the mingled breaths of chemicals and coal heat. Glass jars lined the shelves like pale sentinels, each catching the muted light of dawn and reflecting it through hues of amber, green, and dusty rose. But none drew the eye so quickly, or so completely, as the bottle with the blue label. It stood near the counter, as if it had claimed the place by right. The glass was thick, smooth as polished ice, and the deep cobalt color of its label made it stand apart from the earth-toned tinctures around it. The word ether was written in crisp black ink, the handwriting elegant and restrained, promising scientific certainty in a world of guesswork and suffering. Mr. Thaddeus Coyle, the apothecary himself, polished the counter absently as he waited for the first customers of the day. He had opened before the sun fully rose, a habit he'd developed since the bottles first began to disappear in worrying numbers. Not stolen, not misplaced, sold, always sold, each one leaving the shop with a different owner, each returning only in the form of whispered rumors drifting up and down the street. He found his gaze drawn again to the blue label. There was nothing remarkable about the bottle's design, nothing that should have invited fascination. Yet the moment ether was poured into glass, it seemed to take on a life of its own. Thaddeus had once joked silently that if the bottles were left unattended long enough, they might simply walk off the shelf. A soft tapping at the counter pulled him from his thoughts. A seamstress stood there, Mrs. Lily Pratt, her eyes red-rimmed from too many nights spent awake beside a sick child. "Just a small bottle," she murmured hesitantly. "The doctor said it would ease her coughing fits, only to help her sleep." The words were familiar, painfully so. Thaddeus hesitated, his hand lingering in the air before it closed around the ether bottle. The glass felt warm, as if it had absorbed the breath of every worried customer who had touched it before. He knew all too well how many mothers had stood where she stood now, voice trembling with hope and exhaustion. He measured out the liquid carefully. Each droplet slid down the inner curve of the bottle, smooth as melted sugar. The room filled with that faint, intoxicating sweetness, a scent that softened the sternness in people's faces and loosened the knots in their shoulders. Thaddeus noticed the seamstress sway slightly as she inhaled, just enough to make her blink in surprise. "Only a few drops," he reminded her, stoppering the bottle tightly. "It is gentle until it is not." She nodded but did not meet his eyes. Most customers didn't anymore. The blue-labeled bottle had become a quiet temptation, one they preferred not to name aloud. After she left, the door chiming softly behind her, Thaddeus remained still for a long moment. The dawn light grew stronger, pressing against the window pane like a curious spectator. From outside came the sounds of London waking carriages clattering, hawkers calling, the dull roar of distant factories beginning their day. Yet inside the apothecary, a strange hush lingered. He knew what the neighborhood whispered, that ether was a blessing, a miracle, a softness in a city built on hard edges. But he had also heard the other stories, voices lowered, details vague, as though speaking too clearly might summon misfortune. Stories of men found laughing in alleys long after sunset. Women who drifted away mid-sentence, eyes glazed and wandering. Children asleep so deeply they did not wake until shaken hard. And always, somewhere in those stories, his own bottle with the blue label appeared again. The bell chimed. A factory worker entered, already reaching into his coat for coins. Behind him came a gentleman with silver cufflinks, then a servant girl, then a carpenter, then a pale office clerk who kept rubbing his temples. All of them came for the same thing. All of them glanced at the bottle with the same quiet hunger. Thaddeus served them one by one. His hands never shook. But each time the cork popped free, releasing that sweet, drifting scent, he felt a weight settle heavier upon him. By the time the last customer left, the shelf held only 2 blue-labeled bottles. Outside, the sun finally broke through the fog. Inside, Thaddeus stared at the diminishing row of cobalt glass, realizing with a slow, sinking dread that he no longer sold ether. He fed it to the city, and the city, hungry and trusting, drank deeply. The morning began with rain, the soft, unhurried kind that settled over London like a damp shawl. Drops clung to the windows of St. Bartholomew's Infirmary, trickling down in thin silver threads that blurred the world beyond the glass. Inside, the air was thick with disinfectant, damp wool, and the faint metallic tang of instruments waiting on a tray. But beneath it all, so subtle, one might mistake it for a trick of memory, hung the drifting sweetness of ether. Mr. Elias Hawthorne lay on the table, pale as candle wax, his breaths shallow and uneven. He had arrived before dawn, supported by 2 brothers who spoke in hushed tones, as if raising their voices might worsen his pain. The injury, a deep, jagged tear across the thigh from a machinery accident, had refused to clot. Without intervention, the surgeon had said gently, Elias would lose the leg or the life attached to it. Now he stared up at the ceiling beams, his eyes wide, sweat pooling at his temples. He had heard the rumors everyone had. Ether, they said, was a wonder, a blessing, a miracle. A man could face the knife and feel nothing. He could drift into a soft, floating world free of agony and fear. But he had also heard the other stories whispered in crowded taverns, of those who didn't wake, of those who laughed while dying, of those who slipped too far into the dark and never returned. "Steady now," murmured Dr. Wainwright, stepping into view. His voice carried the careful calm of a man who had grown accustomed to confronting terror with a steady hand. "We shall begin as soon as you are ready." Elias attempted a nod but winced instead. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the sides of the table. Beside the surgeon stood the assistant Thomas, the same boy who had swept the floors the night before. He held the ether-soaked cloth with trembling fingertips, trying to ignore how the scent curled softly into his lungs. The sweetness tugged at his thoughts like a lullaby, played just beyond hearing. The The surgeon lifted the cloth and offered Elias one last look. "You need not fear the blade," Wainwright said. "Just breathe." Elias closed his eyes. The cloth descended. The first breath shuddered through him, a mix of caution and desperation. The second breath came easier. On the third, his body eased, his jaw unclenching, his shoulders sinking into the table as though gravity suddenly loosened its grip. His face relaxed, smoothing into an expression Thomas had rarely seen in the infirmary. Peace. Then came the laugh. Soft, wavering, strangely innocent. It escaped Elias in a gentle trickle, as though someone had lifted a burden from his soul and replaced it with something lighter, something dangerously close to bliss. His brothers exchanged worried glances, but Wainwright nodded for them to remain calm. "Perfectly normal," he said, though his eyes did not leave Elias's face. "He feels nothing now." With the patient drifting, Wainwright turned to his instruments. The gleaming scalpel caught the lamplight, shining like a shard of frozen dawn. Outside, the rain tapped steadily against the window pane, indifferent to the moment unfolding inside. The incision was made. No cry. No flinch. No tightening of fingers or freezing of breath. Elias's mind had drifted somewhere beyond the reach of pain, somewhere soft and weightless, a place that felt like floating inside warm fog. He murmured the name of someone long gone. He whispered half-formed memories. Once, he laughed again quietly, gently, as Wainwright cut deeper. Thomas swallowed hard, the surreal calm unsettling him more than screams ever had. Pain was familiar. Pain made sense. But this eerie stillness felt like watching a man slip beyond the world while still breathing. Minutes passed, then an hour. Finally, the surgeon drew back, hands stained but steady. "It is done," he murmured. Elias lay limp, his chest rising and falling in slow, distant rhythm. It took several long moments before his eyelids fluttered, before the fog inside him began to thin. The room held its breath. When his eyes opened at last, his voice came as a whisper. "Is it over?" "It is," Wainwright said. "You felt nothing at all." Elias managed a faint smile, though confusion shadowed it. He remembered the drifting, the warmth, the strange joy, but nothing else, nothing of the blade or the blood or the fear. Outside, the rain finally stopped, but inside the infirmary, something else opened quietly, invisibly, a door to a world where suffering could be erased and replaced with something dangerously sweet. And London, unknowingly, stepped closer to it every day. The gas lamps hissed softly in the drawing room, casting a warm, honey-colored glow across velvet drapes and polished mahogany. A fire crackled in the hearth, sending shadows quivering along the wallpaper in slow, deliberate waves. This was not the sort of room where danger belonged. It smelled of lavender water, beeswax, and faint rose perfume, the ordinary fragrances of Victorian comfort. But there was a new scent here tonight, drifting beneath the polite chatter and the clinking of porcelain teacups. A sweetness, a sharpness, a whisper that did not belong. Ether. Miss Adeline Partridge had introduced it without a hint of scandal. She stood near the fireplace, her gloved hand poised delicately above a small glass vial with a blue ribbon tied around its neck. Her guests, ladies and gentlemen of modest wealth but great curiosity, watched her with a mixture of fascination and restraint, as though observing a parlour trick rumoured to be dangerous but not yet proven so. "My dears," she said with a bright, brittle smile, "I assure you it is perfectly safe. Why, one feels lighter than air, painless, weightless. It is like discovering a secret door in one's own mind." The women exchanged glances that hovered between caution and desire. The men leaned in slightly, eager but pretending not to be. Parlours such as this thrived on the thrill of the forbidden, delivered under the disguise of refinement. Adeline lifted the vial closer to the lamp. The glass glimmered with soft blue light. The liquid inside shimmered like a captured cloud, "Only a small inhalation," she said lightly. "Enough to quiet the nerves. Enough to forget the dreary London rain, if only for a moment." A gentleman, the sort whose waistcoat was too tight and confidence too brittle, stepped forward. "I suppose," he murmured, "that as it is employed in surgery, it must not be harmful." "Harmful?" Adeline laughed, though her laughter carried an edge too sharp for comfort. "It is liberation." She dipped a lace handkerchief into the ether and offered it to him. The scent burst into the air at once, sweet, cold, intoxicating. The gentleman hesitated only a moment before lifting it toward his face. He inhaled. His eyelids fluttered, his posture loosened. A soft laugh escaped him, the kind one might hear from a child who has just learned a delightful secret. "Oh," he breathed, swaying slightly, "I feel extraordinary." The others whispered excitedly. "Is it truly so pleasant? Does it dull the mind? Does it sharpen it? Does one lose oneself?" Adeline handed the handkerchief to the next curious soul, who inhaled with a mix of fear and longing. Then another, and another. The room grew warmer, hazier, as though the air itself had begun to ripple. The fire crackled louder. The lamps glowed softer. The wallpaper patterns seemed to swirl gently, almost imperceptibly, like ink drifting through water. Voices softened, laughter thickened, movements slowed into graceful, floating gestures. It was no longer a gathering. It was a drifting. Adeline watched them from the hearth, her eyes shining with triumph, and something darker, perhaps recognition, perhaps warning. She had discovered ether at a private medical demonstration weeks earlier, and had left trembling from the experience. Not from fear, but from the startling, delicious sensation of floating above her own life, above responsibilities, above propriety, above loneliness. She knew, even as she introduced it to her guests, that this was no harmless novelty. Ether loosened something inside a person, some inner thread that once tugged loose, rarely tightened again. But the temptation was too great, the sweetness too alluring, the silence too comforting. As the parlour filled with soft sighs and dreamy laughter, a knock sounded at the door, sharp, unexpected, unwelcome. The butler answered quietly, and a cold draught swept into the room. A neighbour stood on the threshold, her eyes wide, her face pale. She had smelled it from the hallway, the sweetness, the sharpness, the warning she could not name. "Is everything quite all right?" she asked, though her voice wavered with dread. Adeline stepped forward, smoothing her dress. "Perfectly," she said calmly, though behind her, her guests drifted in a haze of bliss. The neighbour hesitated. The scent reached her nose. She inhaled without meaning to, and in that single breath, the parlour gained another convert. Ether had left the surgical table. Now it slipped through drawing rooms, drifting easily between curtains and whispered secrets. And London, resourceful, restless, lonely London, was learning to crave it. The fog rolled in earlier than usual that evening, pressing itself against the narrow alleys of Shoreditch like a damp, living thing. Gas lamps glowed in small, trembling halos, barely able to shoulder aside the thick grey curtain. Londoners hurried home with collars raised and hats pulled low, not out of fear, but habit. Nights in the East End often hid more than fog. Yet on this particular night, something else drifted through the streets, something that did not belong to weather or evening gloom. A sweetness, a faint, disorienting sharpness, a scent carried on door cracks and broken windows. Ether. At the corner of Whitehorse Alley, a small group of young mill workers gathered beneath a street lamp that struggled pitifully against the fog. Their clothes still held the dust of the day's labour. Their boots were damp from puddles, their hands rough and blistered, but their eyes bright, restless, hungry, betrayed anticipation. "We oughtn't stay out long," muttered one, a narrow-faced boy named Will. "Old Greeley closes the gates at 10, and he locks them himself." "Oh, hush," said another, Mary with the quick smile. "We've only come to try it once." She said it boldly, but her fingers twisted nervously in the fringe of her shawl. In the center of the group stood Edwin, who worked the looms and often returned home with threads tangled in his hair. Tonight, he held something else tangled in his grasp. A small cloth, folded neatly, damp, with a liquid that glimmered faintly under the gaslight. "I bought it from a clerk off Limehouse," he whispered. "Said the surgeons use it, said it makes everything lighter. Said one forgets pain." "Aye," said Will, voice low. "And sense." But Mary reached for the cloth first. "Let me," she said, determination rising above fear. "I want to know what it feels like to—" Stop thinking for a moment. The others fell silent. They understood. In their world of rattling machines and shouting foremen and endless grey mornings, the idea of stopping, truly stopping, felt like a miracle. Mary lifted the cloth, trembling slightly. The scent reached her first, a cold sweetness that seemed to slip into her lungs before she could decide whether to let it in. She hesitated only a heartbeat before inhaling deeply. Her eyes fluttered. A small laugh escaped her lips, a soft, uncertain sound, like the first note of a song she didn't yet know how to sing. "Oh," she whispered, swaying as though caught by an invisible current. "It's warm. It's lovely. It's—" Another laugh broke free, louder this time, bubbling from her chest, as if joy had been loosened from a place long hidden. The others watched with widened eyes. Laughter was rare among them. True laughter, unforced, unguarded, rarer still. "Let me try," Edwin said quickly. Soon the cloth passed from hand to hand. Each inhale brought the same rapid transformation, fear replaced with bliss, exhaustion softened into weightlessness, harsh reality blurring into something fuzzy-edged and strangely kind. Their laughter grew wilder, spilling into the fog in dizzy ribbons. They stumbled in circles, leaning on one another, eyes glazed but bright. Even Will, who had doubted, found himself giggling helplessly as the ether smoothed the sharp edges of the world. A passerby paused at the corner, startled by the sound. Laughter of this kind didn't belong in these streets. It carried too much abandon, too much dream. He lingered only a moment before continuing on, shaking his head and muttering that young people were losing their sense. But the fog kept the secret, and the sweet drifting scent kept growing. The cloth made its rounds a second time, and then a third. With each inhale, the group fell deeper into that strange floating world. The street lamp flickered, stretching their shadows in slow, swaying movements across the cobblestones. No one noticed the hour passing. No one heard the distant church bells. No one remembered Greeley's gates closing. Will collapsed onto a crate, laughing so hard tears streamed down his cheeks. Mary leaned against the wall, humming tunelessly, while Edwin spun in soft, dreamlike circles. They had wanted escape for one night, but ether had quietly offered something more, something addictive, a way to forget. When the fog finally thinned and the lamplight steadied, the laughter faded into shivers. The cold settled deep. Eyes once bright with dreamy pleasure now blinked with disorientation. Limbs felt heavier. Thoughts muddied. Shame crept in around the edges. "We should go," Mary murmured, clutching her shawl. "We should have gone an hour ago." But the alley had already changed. They had changed. As they stumbled home separately, each felt a tug behind the ribs, a strange craving, soft but insistent, a longing not for laughter, but for the moment before laughter, when the ether first touched their lungs like a whispered promise. It would not be their last night of unsteady laughter. London was beginning to learn the taste of chemical bliss, and it would not forget it easily. The morning sun had barely risen above the chimneys of Bishopsgate when the line began to form outside Mr. Thaddeus Coyle's apothecary. It started quietly, one customer arriving earlier than usual, then another, then a pair who lingered along the pavement as though pretending to admire the window display. By the time Thaddeus unlocked the door, the line stretched nearly to the corner. a ribbon of anxious faces wrapped in scarves and cold breath. He blinked at the crowd, surprised, but not entirely unprepared. The city had been shifting these past weeks, pulled by a sweetness he could neither contain nor control. Ether. Always ether. He lifted the latch and stepped aside as the bell chimed overhead. The scent of damp wool and impatience swept inside with the customers. Some carried coins already clutched in gloved hands. Others avoided meeting his eyes. A few looked as though shame battled need behind their stiff collars. The first to approach the counter was Mr. Dillard, a clerk from the solicitor's office across the lane. He placed a coin on the polished wood, its metallic ring trembling through the quiet shop. "Another bottle, Mr. Coyle," he murmured. "My nerves are unsettled again." Thaddeus hesitated. Mr. Dillard had purchased one just 3 days prior, but the man's eyes were sunken beneath sleepless shadows, his hands trembling faintly. "Are you certain it is ether you require?" Thaddeus asked softly. Mr. Dillard nodded too quickly. "Quite certain. The relief it brings is immediate. I can work again. Think again. Please." Thaddeus fetched the bottle. As he did, the line behind Dillard shifted uneasily, people leaning forward ever so slightly, watching the blue-labeled vial, as though witnessing a sacrament. The apothecary could feel their anticipation like a pulse running through the room. Next came Mrs. Forsyth, a laundress whose fingers were red and raw from hot water and lye. "My joints ache something awful," she said. "Just a little to help me rest." Then a young soldier on medical leave, arm in a sling. Then a maid whose employer suffered terribly from nerves, though her eyes betrayed that perhaps the bottle was not for her mistress at all. Then an old man whose creaking gait spoke of a lifetime of hard winters. Then a schoolteacher who looked ready to weep from exhaustion. All of them asking for the same thing. All of them pretending they asked for something ordinary. By midday, Thaddeus had sold more ether than he had in a full week just months ago. He restocked the shelf in neat rows, but each row evaporated with startling speed. The sweet chemical scent lingered in the air of the shop, mingling with the earthy smells of herbal tinctures and drying botanicals. It hovered like a ghost, like a promise. At one point, he stepped into the back room to catch his breath. The quiet felt foreign. He leaned heavily against the wall beside a crate half filled with unopened bottles. The city is losing itself, he thought. It wasn't the first time the thought had struck him, but today, with the line still pressing against the door and the bell chiming constantly, the truth felt heavier than ever. Ether was no longer a scientific marvel. It had become a balm for a weary city, a dangerous balm, silent and seductive. When he returned to the counter, he found Thomas, the errand boy, staring at the dwindling shelf with something like dread. "They'll want the whole supply by tomorrow," Thomas whispered. "Perhaps," Thaddeus said quietly, "though I fear what that means." The boy turned toward the window, watching the fog gather again outside. The line had shortened for the moment, but more figures approached from the street, hesitant at first, then drawn forward with quiet resolve. All day they came. Some left relieved, others trembling with anticipation. A few lingered in the doorway after purchasing their bottles, lifting them slightly as though weighing the promise inside. As dusk settled and the last customer departed, Thaddeus locked the door and turned the sign to closed. The shop was dim, lit only by the final glow of the window lamps. Shelves that once held dozens of bottles now held 3. 3 from an entire shipment. He sank onto a stool, rubbing his temples as the lingering scent of ether filled his lungs. London had found its new comfort, its new escape, its new quiet obsession. And Thaddeus, sitting alone in the dim shop, realized something unsettling. The line outside his door would only grow longer. Not tomorrow, not next week, but tonight, and every night after, for the city had discovered the sweetness beneath its suffering, and it had no intention of letting go. The tenement on Narrow Harrow Lane was always cold, even in summer, but that night the chill felt different, heavier, thicker, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. A single candle burned on the crooked windowsill, its flame wavering against the draughts that slipped through cracks in the warped glass. The room smelled faintly of boiled cabbage, damp wood, and something else soft, sweet, chemical, ether. Martha Briggs had not intended to use it. Not really. She had purchased the bottle from Mr. Coyle's apothecary after hearing the neighbours whisper that it soothed sickly children, quieted their coughing, lulled them into needed sleep. Just a drop, they said. Just enough to ease the little lungs. But sleep had been scarce in the Briggs household for weeks. Little Henry's cough rattled like loose gravel inside him. Every breath sounded like a plea. Every night, Martha sat beside him until her back ached from bending, until her eyes burned from exhaustion, until she could no longer distinguish the sound of his crying from the echo of her own heartbeat. Tonight, she reached for the blue-labeled bottle with trembling hands. Only one drop, she reminded herself. Only one. Henry lay curled beneath a patched quilt, his tiny chest shuddering with each inhale. His face, always pale, seemed almost transparent in the candlelight. Martha brushed a damp curl from his forehead and pressed the cloth gently to his lips. "Just a moment, my love," she whispered, "just to help you rest." The scent rose quickly, sweet, cold, unnerving. Henry inhaled reflexively. The cough paused. His eyelids fluttered. His little fingers loosened their grasp on the blanket. Martha waited. The transformation was subtle at first. His breathing softened, his body relaxed, becoming suddenly heavy against the thin mattress. His face smoothed, as though some invisible hand had soothed away every ache and fear. He looked peaceful, too peaceful. Martha felt a swell of relief so sharp it nearly broke her. She kissed his forehead and finally allowed herself to lie down beside him. Her eyes closed almost instantly from exhaustion, though the sweet ether scent clung to her thoughts like mist. When morning crept in, pale and reluctant, the candle had burned itself out. Martha awoke sore and disoriented. For a moment she lay still, listening for the familiar cough that usually greeted dawn. The room was silent but for the distant sound of hawkers setting up their stalls. Too silent. "Henry," she whispered, sitting up quickly. He did not stir. Her hands shook violently as she touched his cheek. His skin was warm but unnaturally still. His lashes rested softly against unmoving cheeks. His chest rose, but so faintly she had to bend close to see it. "Henry," she pleaded, voice cracking. He did not wake. She lifted him gently, cradling him in trembling arms. His limbs were limp, his head resting heavily against her shoulder. He looked as though he had drifted into the deepest, safest sleep imaginable, yet terror clawed at Martha's throat. She called for a neighbour, then another. Soon, the tenement buzzed with uneasy whispers. Women clutched their shawls tighter. Children pressed close to their mothers. The scent in the air told them everything. "It was the ether," someone murmured. "You must have given too much." "He'll wake, won't he?" "Children sleep lighter than adults. He should have stirred by now." "Oh, Martha! Oh, Martha!" But Henry did not wake. Not when the doctor arrived with his black bag and weary eyes. Not when he lifted the boy's eyelids and frowned at the slow, sticky movement beneath. Not when he pressed his ear to Henry's chest and listened long enough to turn ashen. "He is alive," the doctor said at last, "but deeply under. Much deeper than a child should ever be." Martha's knees buckled. "It was only a drop," she sobbed. "Only one, just one." Outside, the neighbours gathered quietly, exchanging glances heavy with fear. The story would spread by afternoon. By nightfall, entire streets would whisper it, a mother's kindness turned perilous by a miracle too easily trusted. London had embraced ether with open arms until now. Now it tasted the first bitter hint of consequence. Behind the doctor's solemn voice, behind the mother's breaking sobs, behind the child's motionless calm, a truth settled heavily upon the neighborhood. Ether did not always soothe. Sometimes it stole, and Henry Briggs, still breathing but unreachable, became the first small, sleeping warning of what the city had invited into its homes. The fog had not yet lifted when Thaddeus Coyle arrived at his apothecary the next morning. It clung to the rooftops and pressed against the windows like a mournful visitor waiting for permission to enter. He stood outside the shop for a long moment, keys in hand, staring at the faint reflection of his own tired face in the glass. Behind him, the city-stirred street vendors setting out their wares, carriage wheels splashing through puddles, children hurrying toward work as though childhood were a luxury they had already outgrown. But the fog was not what made Thaddeus hesitate. It was the knock he'd heard the night before, sharp and panicked Mrs. Calloway from the tenements, pleading that her neighbor's child would not wake. She had spoken Henry Briggs's name, her voice shaking. She had said the word ether, though she barely understood what it meant. He hadn't slept since. Inside, the apothecary smelled as it always did, dried herbs, bitter bark, sugar lozenges, polished oak, and underneath it all, the faint sweetness of something far more potent. Ether drifted from the shelves even when the bottles were sealed. It clung to the cracks in the wood and the folds of curtains. It was becoming part of the shop itself. Thaddeus lit the lamps and started his morning routine, sweeping, straightening, polishing the counter. Yet each motion felt mechanical, hollow, disconnected from his thoughts. The weight on his chest did not ease. His hands trembled more than he cared to admit. When he finally reached the shelf where the ether bottles stood, he paused. Only 2 remained. 2, from the dozens he had stocked only weeks earlier. He traced a finger along one of the blue labels. A child had nearly died, and the bottle had come from here. He knew he could blame society's carelessness, or the tenement rumors, or the desperation of a mother who had not slept in days. But responsibility, once it settles, does not easily move again. The bell above the door chimed. He turned. Thomas stood there, his young assistant, cap in hand, eyes shy and unsure. "Morning, sir," he said. "I came early. Thought you might need help." Thaddeus nodded, though the attempt at a smile felt thin. Thomas hesitated before stepping farther in. "Sir, I heard about the Briggs child. Everyone's talking." "Are they?" Thaddeus muttered, turning his back to the boy. It was easier not to meet his gaze. "They say he won't wake." Thaddeus closed his eyes. The guilt pressed harder. Thomas approached the counter slowly. "Sir, do you think it was?" "Yes," Thaddeus whispered before the boy could finish. "Yes, I do." Silence stretched between them. Outside, a costermonger shouted about fresh apples, his call muffled by the fog. Inside, the lamps flickered faintly. Finally, Thomas spoke in a small, fragile voice. "You didn't force anyone to buy it." "But I sold it," Thaddeus replied, knowing how easily it tempts, how little people understand. He gestured toward the bottles. "How many came here seeking relief, not knowing that escape can be more dangerous than pain?" Thomas swallowed, glancing at the remaining ether. "Will you stop selling it?" Thaddeus wished the answer came easily, but it did not. "People will still find it," he said quietly. "If not here, then in the back alleys, from men who measure greed instead of care. At least here, I can warn them." But even as he said it, he was unsure whether he spoke truth or justification. Another chime of the bell interrupted them. A man stepped inside, cloak dripping rainwater, eyes red with lack of sleep. "Mr. Coyle," he said urgently, "I need more ether." Thaddeus stiffened. "I'm afraid—" "Please," the man interrupted. "My wife, she cannot bear the nights anymore. The pain is too great. Just a little, sir. Just enough to help her rest." The plea twisted something inside Thaddeus, compassion, dread, guilt, all woven together like strands of frayed rope. He should refuse. He knew he should. But the man's hands shook. His breath quivered. His suffering was real, immediate, unignorable. And Thaddeus, with a sinking heart, reached for the bottle. Thomas watched him, lips pressed tight. As Thaddeus measured the dose, the sweet smell rose again, gentle, dangerous, quiet as a whispered promise. He felt it curl around him, the guilt deepening with every breath. He handed the bottle over with a stern warning, though he knew warnings were softer than desperation. After the man left, Thomas approached him slowly. "You feel responsible, sir," he said softly. "But London is changing. People want something to help them forget." Thaddeus looked at the empty doorway, at the fading footprints of the man who had left. "Yes," he murmured, "and I fear forgetting will destroy us faster than remembering ever could." He extinguished one of the lamps, though dawn had fully arrived. The shop felt colder. The ether bottles glimmered faintly in the dim light, patient, inviting, indifferent. And Thaddeus Coyle, the chemist who felt responsible, stood alone with the terrible realization that London was drifting somewhere he could not pull it back from. London had always known fog, thick, grey, smothering, a creature that slipped between chimneys and curled down alleyways like a blind serpent. But this fog was different. It came not only from the river, nor solely from the factories belching their endless plumes into the sky. This fog carried a new scent, faint yet persistent, drifting through the streets with unsettling familiarity. A sweetness, a sharpness, a memory of something medical. Ether. It was first noticed by constables on the night watch. They reported that the air in certain streets, Bishopsgate, Whitechapel, parts of the Strand, smelled vaguely of an infirmary after midnight. Not unpleasant, but undeniably strange, as though London had breathed deeply of some unseen chemical, as though the city itself had begun to float. That morning, Mrs. Prim, who sold ribbons from a small stall near Ludgate Hill, wrinkled her nose as she set out her wares. "Smells like the surgeon's rooms," she muttered to her neighbour, tying a neat bow with irritated fingers. "And I've not stepped foot in one of those in 30 years. Her neighbour, Mr. Hemsworth, the cobbler, sniffed the air thoughtfully. Aye, as though someone spilled their tinctures across the street. By noon, the scent was everywhere, diluted but unmistakable. It clung to coats, to hair, to the folds of wool scarves. It drifted from open windows and cracked doors. It hovered above the river like a ghostly hand spread wide over the water. Even the horses noticed. They tossed their heads nervously, hooves clattering as they tried to escape the strange aroma. Drivers cursed, pulling reins tight, unaware that the animals sensed something Londoners refused to admit. Their city was changing. Along Fleet Street, Thomas hurried toward the apothecary with a loaf of bread under his arm, dodging puddles and pushing through crowds. The fog wrapped around him, bringing with it a scent that tightened his chest with unease. Ether. It was everywhere now. He paused at the corner, watching a group of boys kick a ragged ball through the street. They laughed, kicking and stumbling, but one of them suddenly stopped mid-play. His face slackened. He swayed slightly, as though dizzy. "George?" one of the boys asked. "Oi, George, what's wrong?" George blinked slowly, eyes clouded. "Dunno," he murmured. "Air smells funny." Thomas stepped closer. The ether scent around the boy was stronger, too strong. "Have you been near the factories?" Thomas asked. George shook his head. "Nor. Only walked past the boarding house on Blackfriars Road. Smelled sweet there, like Uncle's medicine." Thomas's stomach twisted. Another place. Another neighbourhood touched by the haze. By the time he reached the apothecary, the bell above the door chimed loudly, as though startled. Thaddeus looked up from the counter, expression drawn. "You smell it too," Thomas said breathlessly. "Yes," Thaddeus replied, voice flat. "All morning. Customers came complaining their streets smell of ether. Some swear it leaked from my shop. He shook his head, weary. But it isn't only here. Thomas lowered the loaf. It's everywhere, sir. Thaddeus rested his palms on the counter, knuckles pale. This city has inhaled so deeply these past weeks. Perhaps it's only now exhaling. They stood in silence. Outside, the fog pressed against the window, thick and pale, blurring the outlines of passing figures. A woman walked by, pausing suddenly to steady herself on a lamppost. A baker halted mid-step, blinking as if waking from an uninvited dream. The city felt light-headed. The ether scent moved between buildings and along rooftops, a quiet tide touching every district without discrimination. It soaked into cloth and brick. It settled into the lungs of men who had never seen a surgeon's table and children who couldn't spell the word ether. In the afternoon, a carriage overturned on the corner of Aldgate when the driver fainted at the reins. A man in a tailor shop collapsed into a dreamy stupor, needle still in hand. A woman in a fish market laughed uncontrollably for several minutes before slumping to the ground. Londoners blamed exhaustion, heat, cold, overwork, bad air. But those who had used ether before knew better. They recognized the drifting sweetness, the soft numbness, the strange weightlessness that pulled at the mind like invisible hands. Entire blocks now smelled faintly of medicine, as though the city had become one enormous infirmary, breathing through every brick and alley. And that night, when the fog returned thicker than before, London inhaled again, deeply, quietly, unknowingly. The city's heartbeat grew softer, its laughter grew stranger, its nights grew longer. For the fog did not merely smell of medicine, it smelled of dependence, of escape, of a sweet, dangerous promise carried on every drifting breath. London had taken its first collective step into the ether haze, and the city was beginning to float. The lecture hall of St. Bartholomew's Medical College was colder than usual that evening. Damp crept along the stone floor and gathered in the corners like a silent audience. Rows of wooden benches stretched before the raised podium, each one polished smooth by decades of restless students shifting, scribbling, whispering. Tonight, however, the benches were filled with young men sitting unusually still, collars crisp, notebooks open, pens poised like tiny weapons ready to capture the words of London's most respected surgeon. Dr. Aldrich Wainwright stepped forward, spectacles glinting beneath the wavering gas lamps. He looked older than he had the previous month. The soft lines around his eyes had deepened. A faint tremor touched his right hand whenever he lifted it from his side. He carried no surgical tools this time, only a single glass vial sealed tightly with wax. The students leaned forward. They expected brilliance. They expected praise for the miracle of modern anesthesia. They expected reassurance that the era of painless surgery had arrived like a gift from the heavens. Instead, they received a warning. "Gentlemen," Wainwright began, his voice low, scraped raw by sleepless nights, "we must speak plainly about the substance that has changed our profession in ways we have yet to fully understand." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Ether. They knew he meant ether. Wainwright held up the vial. Under the gaslight, the liquid inside shimmered faintly innocent, almost beautiful. Yet the surgeon's eyes did not reflect admiration. They reflected dread. "We have celebrated its power," he continued, "but we have ignored its consequences." Several students exchanged uncertain glances. Consequences? What consequences? Ether produced miracles on the operating table, everyone said so. Newspapers called it the painless dawn of a new age. Wealthy patrons requested demonstrations for their dinner guests. Even the public, who once fainted at the thought of operations, now spoke with fascination of the magic vapor that silenced agony. But Wainwright had seen something they had not. He set the vial down with a soft tap that echoed through the hollow room. "When the patient breathes too deeply," he said slowly, They sink into a sleep from which they do not easily return. Some drift for minutes, others for hours. His mouth tightened. A few do not wake. The hall fell silent. He described the man who laughed through an entire amputation, unaware of blood soaking the floor beneath him. He described a woman who murmured childhood lullabies as she slipped deeper and deeper, unresponsive even after the surgery ended. He described a child, small, fragile, who floated so far into ether's grasp that no amount of calling or shaking could pull her back for nearly a full day. These, my students, are not triumphs. His voice cracked. These are warnings. But warnings, like smoke, are easy to ignore when the air already smells of sweetness. A hand shot up in the front row. "Sir," a young man asked, trying to sound confident, "is it not the surgeon's task to measure carefully, to prevent such excess?" Wainwright stared at him with weary patience. Ether does not behave as predictably as laudanum or alcohol. It slips into the lungs with alarming speed. The difference between relief and danger is a mere breath, no more. Another student, bolder, called out from the back, "But surely the benefits outweigh the risks?" Patients beg for it. "Yes," Wainwright said quietly, "and that is precisely the problem." He described what he had witnessed beyond the operating room. Men stumbling through alleys with gleaming eyes, women in drawing rooms inhaling from perfumed cloths as though sampling exotic sweets, workers drifting into trances during breaks, children found asleep beside bottles they did not know how to handle. Ether was no longer confined to medical use. It had become a temptation, a comfort, a refuge, a danger spreading faster than any plague. Wainwright looked at the sea of faces before him. Future surgeons, future decision-makers, future men who would guide the city's health. "You must treat this substance with respect," he said. "More respect than society currently gives it. Do not be seduced by its ease. Do not underestimate its reach. London is inhaling deeply, and the consequences will not remain in the streets. They will follow us into our hospitals, our homes, our lives." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. But the students, eager, ambitious, dazzled by the promise of painless surgery, shifted in their seats. Their eyes glimmered not with fear, but with fascination. Ether was too miraculous, too convenient, too astonishing to question. They heard his words, but they did not understand them. Not yet. When the lecture ended, they filed out with excited whispering, already debating techniques, doses, and demonstrations. Wainwright remained alone on the podium, staring at the little glass vial. He knew the truth. London had fallen in love with ether, and the city rarely listened to warnings, especially when the danger arrived sweetly, softly, and without a single scream. The surgeon blew out the lamp and walked into the fog. His warning faded with the flame. It began as nothing more than an evening diversion, an intimate gathering hosted in the genteel home of Mr. and Mrs. Whitcomb, a couple whose reputation for tasteful soirees had long been the comfort of their Kensington circle. Their parlour, adorned with embroidered cushions and a chandelier that dripped crystal like frozen rain, was meant for polite laughter, card games, and soft piano melodies drifting beneath the murmur of conversation. But on that particular night, the room held an additional presence, something sweeter, colder, sharper than the scent of blooming lilies arranged carefully on every table. Ether. Its arrival was subtle. A small bottle, blue-labelled, carried discreetly in the coat pocket of Mr. Percival Dunley, a man whose greatest fear in life was being described as ordinary. He had attended a demonstration weeks prior and had watched in breathless fascination as a surgeon placed a cloth over a man's face and turned agony into laughter. Dunley had not forgotten that laugh, the way it rose like champagne bubbles through the heavy air of the operating theatre. He wanted to experience it himself. More importantly, He wanted to be the first in his circle to share it. The Whitcombes, eager to impress, offered no resistance when he presented the bottle with an extravagant flourish. "It is entirely safe," Dunley proclaimed, twisting the cork free with a soft pop that released the first curl of its sweetness into the chandelier-lit air. A miracle of modern science, a spectacle of the age. Mrs. Whitcomb blinked nervously. "Is it intoxicating?" "Only delightfully so." The guests leaned forward, curiosity warming their cheeks. A cloth was found embroidered, expensive, utterly unsuited for such a purpose, but pressed enthusiastically into service. Dunley soaked it carefully, every drop glistening like liquid frost. "Who shall be first?" he asked. The answer came in the form of laughter, a high, tinkling giggle from Miss Beatrice Yarrow, whose desire for novelty consistently outweighed her caution. "I will," she declared, stepping forward with a theatrical flutter of eyelashes. She inhaled sharply as the cloth neared her face. The scent hit her immediately, sweet and icy. She swayed, blinked, then smiled with a softness that unsettled the watchers. "Oh," she murmured, her voice drifting like the fog outside. "It's lovely, like floating." Her knees buckled gently, and Dunley caught her with triumphant pride. "Marvelous," he cried. "Absolutely marvelous." The others needed no more encouragement. The cloth passed from hand to eager hand. Inhalations grew deeper. Breaths grew slower. Voices softened into dreamy half-sentences that dissolved before completion. Soon the parlour no longer felt like a proper gathering. The chandelier blurred into halos of light. The wallpaper swayed as though stirred by an unseen breeze. Guests reclined on fainting couches, collapsed in velvet armchairs, or drifted to the floor in loose-limbed heaps of muffled giggles and closed eyes. At first their laughter was bright, carefree, musical. But then it changed. It grew stranger, slower, disjointed. One gentleman laughed too long, long after the joke had faded, until the sound cracked into hiccups and moans. Another lay on the rug staring at the ceiling, his gaze unfocused, whispering names no one recognized. Mrs. Whitcomb found herself unable to rise from the chaise longue, limbs heavy as lead, mind drifting far from the gilded room she could no longer command. The pianist attempted to resume playing, hands trembling, but he struck the wrong keys until the music warped into something eerie and discordant. "Perhaps we've had enough," he muttered, voice unsteady. But Dunley, now laughing uncontrollably at nothing at all, shook his head. "Nonsense! It's delightful, delightful!" He staggered backward, knocking over a lamp, which toppled onto the carpet. The flame sputtered dangerously before someone rolled onto it by accident, snuffing it out with a muffled groan. In the hallway, the Whitcombes' maid hovered uncertainly, listening. This was no ordinary party. She smelled it before she understood it, the cold sweetness that made the hairs on her arms rise. She pushed the door open. The room looked like a battlefield of sleeping revelers, faces slack, limbs tangled, laughter fading into long, eerie silences. The chandelier flickered overhead, its crystals trembling as though recoiling from the scene below. "Sir?" she whispered, shaking Dunley's shoulder. His smile remained fixed, eerie and wrong, but his eyes would not focus. "Madam?" she tried next, but Mrs. Whitcomb lay motionless, breathing shallowly, her lace gloves crumpled against her chest. Fear clawed up the maid's throat. Outside, the fog pressed against the window, thick and watchful, as if London itself waited for the outcome. One by one, she dragged the guests toward open windows, letting cold air wash over them. Some stirred, some didn't, some woke laughing, some woke crying. By dawn, the parlour was quiet, ruined, disordered, and aching with the memory of a sweetness gone sharply wrong. News spread quickly, though whispered with care. It was not the last party that drifted out of control, but it was the first that made London realize the truth. Ether was not merely a novelty. It was an intruder, one that slipped beneath doors, into lungs, into minds, and turned polite society into something dangerously fragile. The Hawthorne residence on Queen's Crescent prided itself on order, an immaculate household run, with quiet discipline, polished brass, trimmed hedges, and rules so precise they seemed etched into the walls themselves. Within this tidy world moved Miss Eleanor Birch, the governess. She was a thin, thoughtful woman with soft eyes that seldom revealed the swell of worry lingering beneath her calm exterior. She taught arithmetic and scripture to the Hawthorne children, corrected their posture, oversaw their lessons, and ensured their behavior never reflected poorly upon the family name. But no one noticed how often her hands trembled. She had worked in service for nearly a decade, drifting from household to household, never staying long enough to be remembered by more than a few polite nods. The Hawthorne home, though comfortable, was no kinder than the rest, a place where silence was prized, emotions discouraged, and the staff expected to appear tireless even on days when exhaustion gnawed at their bones. For Miss Birch, the exhaustion had become unmanageable months earlier. Sleepless nights followed long days. The children's lessons blurred together, and migraines, those pounding, merciless beasts, began to take root behind her temples. She learned to work through the pain, but each day felt heavier than the last. Until the housemaid, Lottie, a girl barely 17, whispered to her one evening in the dim warmth of the kitchen. "There's something that helps," Lottie murmured, glancing toward the doorway to ensure privacy. "A sweet medicine. Mr. Coyle sells it on Bishopsgate. A drop or two eases the ache, puts you right to sleep." Miss Birch raised an eyebrow. "Does it truly work?" Lottie nodded quickly. "Better than anything I've tried." And so began Eleanor Birch's quiet descent. She purchased her first bottle with trembling hands, promising herself it would be used only sparingly, only when truly needed. The ether worked quickly, too quickly. One breath softened her thoughts. Two sent her drifting into a sleep, deeper and sweeter than anything she had known since childhood. For the first time in years, she rested, truly rested. She awoke lighter, refreshed, almost giddy. She told herself she would only use it once more, then only once more after that. And then again, when the headaches returned, and again when the children grew unruly, and again when the household demands became unbearable. By late autumn, the small bottle with the blue label lived in her apron pocket. No one noticed at first, but one evening, as the children practiced penmanship near the hearth, Miss Birch sat nearby stitching a torn cuff. Her movements were precise, her posture perfect, yet her eyelids drooped, her breath slowed, and the scent of faint sweetness clung to her skirts. "Miss Birch?" little Clara whispered. "Are you tired?" The governess startled, pricking her finger. A drop of blood bloomed on the linen. "No, my dear," she said too quickly. "Just distracted." But the room swayed around her. The children's voices blurred. The crackling fire pulsed with unsettling rhythm. Later that night, after lessons ended and the children were sent upstairs, Miss Birch sought solitude in the shadowed corridor near the servants' staircase. Her head throbbed, her nerves ached. She reached into her apron for the familiar vial. Just a little, she told herself. Enough to steady the world. She lifted the cloth to her face. The scent washed over her, instantly sweet, cold, silent. Her shoulders loosened. Her thoughts softened. The oppressive weight of duty, expectation, propriety, all dissolved like mist beneath sunlight. She leaned back against the wall, letting the darkness cradle her. But she did not hear the footsteps approaching. Mrs. Hawthorne rounded the corner with sharp precision, her candle casting a thin column of light across the corridor. She stopped abruptly. The flame flickered as her eyes narrowed. "Miss Birch," she said, voice taut. "What are you doing?" The governess blinked slowly, the cloth still in her hand. her words tangled together before she could form them. "I needed a moment, madam." Mrs. Hawthorne stepped closer. The candlelight revealed the half-lidded gaze, the flush of drifting warmth, the unmistakable scent in the air. "Ether." Her lips tightened. "I hired you to guide my children, not to disgrace this household." Miss Birch tried to speak, but her tongue felt heavy. "You may collect your wages tomorrow," Mrs. Hawthorne said coldly. "Then you will leave this house immediately." The candle moved away. Footsteps faded. And Miss Birch remained alone in the corridor, the sweetness of ether still clinging to her breath, her livelihood slipping through her fingers as easily as the drifting vapor. She slid to the floor, silent tears blending with the haze. Ether had given her rest, but it had taken everything else. By dawn, she had vanished from Queen's Crescent without farewell. Only the lingering sweetness in the hall remained, a whisper of where she had gone and of how easily a woman could slip away in a city already drifting into its own chemical fog. In the labyrinth of London's East End, where alleys twisted like forgotten veins and lanterns burned low from neglect, there existed a narrow passage known only to those who had reason to find it. Night after night, it filled with figures who moved not with purpose, but with a curious drifting slowness, like sleepwalkers, unsure whether they were waking or dreaming. Harrow Mill Alley. It was the kind of place that didn't appear on maps, a cut-through between workshops and warehouses where rainwater pooled in long, stagnant puddles. Laundry lines sagged overhead like faint ghosts. Rats scuttled along the walls, cautious but unafraid. And recently, so recently, the city had barely begun to speak of it. The air there carried the unmistakable scent of something sweet and cold. Ether. The first time the constables mentioned it, they spoke in clipped tones. Men slumped against brick walls, as though time itself had forgotten them. Women sat on overturned crates, humming tunelessly, eyes half-lidded. One boy, hardly 12, stared up at the fog with a smile that did not belong on a child's face, soft, distant, unsettling. It had begun slowly. A few factory boys passing around a soaked rag after their shifts, a seamstress seeking refuge from the biting cold, a dock worker who said ether made the hours melt away, easing the ache in his bones. But the alley spread the habit like damp spreading through cloth quietly, inevitably. Tonight, the fog thickened early, settling into Harrow Mill Alley like a second skin. One by one, the regulars arrived. Not with urgency, but with that eerie, floating gait known only to those who had inhaled too much sweetness. Isaac Brewer was among them, a cooper by trade, shoulders broad and hands calloused from years of shaping barrels. He had once been known for his precise craftsmanship, but lately his work had slowed. His eyes often wandered. His wife whispered of worry, his employer whispered of dismissal. Isaac didn't speak much anymore, not since he discovered what a single breath of ether could do. He entered the alley with his coat pulled tight, though he no longer felt the cold. The familiar scent reached him before he reached the others. It swirled through the air like a soft invitation, pressing into his lungs before he could even choose whether to breathe. Two men leaned against the wall beside him, sharing a scrap of cloth as though sharing a secret. Their laughter was sluggish, melting into the fog like honey dissolving into warm tea. "Evening, Isaac," one murmured, voice thick. "You're late." Isaac shook his head slowly. "Didn't mean to be." Someone to his right giggled Mary Turner, a woman whose hands once stitched fine lace but now trembled so constantly she could barely hold a needle. She beckoned Isaac forward. "Come on then," she said. "The world feels softer tonight." Isaac hesitated, though the hesitation was more memory than conviction. His fingers reached automatically for the cloth Mary held. The scent burst upward, sweet, sharp, dizzying. He inhaled. The alley warped. Sounds stretched echoes of distant carts rolling through the street suddenly elongated, like notes from an organ played too slowly. Footsteps became thunderous and then faded entirely. Someone laughed, and the laugh unfurled in the air like a ribbon floating on water. The lamplight flickered in strange patterns. Each flame seemed to pause mid-waver, trapped between motions. Even Isaac's own breath felt delayed, suspended between inhale and exhale. Time itself seemed to loosen. Around him, bodies moved with dreamlike sluggishness. A man slumped down the wall in what felt like minutes, but perhaps it was seconds. A woman dropped her handkerchief. It drifted to the ground as if caught in syrup. A stray dog wandered through the alley and seemed to cross it in slow, hesitant frames. Here, ether did not merely cloud minds. It bent moments, stretched them, erased the urgency that normally governed life. Isaac closed his eyes. The world pulsed. He heard his name spoken softly once, twice, but the sound seemed to reach him from across a great distance. When he opened his eyes again, Mary was staring at him with a hollow calm he did not understand. "Don't drift too far," she said, voice slow as dripping wax. "If you go too deep, the alley won't let you come back." He tried to laugh, but even laughter felt delayed, as though trapped behind a pane of glass. Far down the alley, a lamp swung wildly as a constable's silhouette appeared sharp, determined, foreign to the slowing world of Harrowmill. His voice cut through the haze with unnatural speed. "Clear out, immediately." But the revelers did not respond quickly. Some didn't respond at all. The constable's heavy footsteps echoed too loudly, too fast, like intrusions from a world moving at proper pace. He seized one man by the shoulder, only to recoil as the limp body slid to the ground. Isaac blinked, confused. Had the man fallen? Had the constable dropped him? Or had the alley itself slowed the fall before allowing it to land? "Up! On your feet!" the constable barked. But the words felt meaningless. Harrowmill Alley had its own rhythm now, sluggish, dreamlike, dangerous. Isaac clutched the wall to steady himself. For a moment, he could almost see the place as it was dark, filthy, cold. But then ether's sweetness wrapped around him again, tugging him back into the drifting. The constable's voice faded. The alley pulsed. Time slowed once more. And Isaac Brewer, like so many others, surrendered to the pace of a city slipping deeper into its chemical haze, one unsteady breath at a time. Hidden beneath the gaslit bustle of Covent Garden, down a staircase that smelled faintly of damp stone and spilled gin, lay a place few admitted to knowing, and even fewer dared speak of aloud. The entrance was nothing more than an unmarked wooden door set into the foundation of a flower shop, its brass knob tarnished by countless hands that visited under night's cover. There was no signboard, no hours posted, no list of patrons. It was known only as The Hollow, though no one could recall who first named it. Like everything else in London that the city preferred to forget, ether found a home there. The lanterns inside burned low. Their light filtered through amber shades that gave the room a honeyed haze. Velvet curtains hung like tired sentinels. The air carried a mingling of perfume, pipe smoke, and the now familiar sweetness of ether. It drifted from tables and alcoves, curling through the dim space like a ribbon of pale fog. Unlike London's respectable drawing rooms, the Hollow did not pretend. It existed for one purpose: to let the city's weary souls drift. The clientele ranged wildly. Bank clerks with ink-stained fingers sat beside aristocrats who hid their faces behind opera masks. Factory foremen shared tables with artists whose paint still clung to their sleeves. Women of every class, maids, widows, actresses, heiresses, slipped through the curtains with equal anonymity. No one here cared for status. Ether leveled them all, softening their voices, slowing their movements, dissolving the boundaries that ruled the city above. At the far end of the room sat the club's unofficial host, a tall man with a narrow face, known only as Silas. His coat was always immaculate, his gloves always spotless, his expression always unreadable. He did not serve drinks, though glasses appeared at his table as though conjured from the shadows. He did not encourage the use of ether, yet no one doubted it flowed freely because of him. Silas understood what the city hungered for long before the city admitted its appetite. On this particular night, the club thrummed with quiet anticipation. The fog outside was unusually thick, and every time the door opened, tendrils of cold air slipped down the stairwell like curious observers. People entered in twos and threes, their steps soft, their eyes carrying exhaustion that no amount of sleep could remedy. Among them was Clara Astley, daughter of a wealthy barrister. She wore a hooded cloak, its fabric too fine for the district, but fear and shame had persuaded her to disguise herself. Her father believed her to be visiting a cousin in Bloomsbury. Her cousin believed she was at the theatre. Neither knew she stood now at the threshold of an underground sanctuary. Her hands trembled as she stepped inside. She had heard whispers of this place, rumors traded among restless debutantes who longed for escape from polite society. Ether, they said, could loosen the tight corsets of expectation. It could silence the endless chatter of reputation, marriage prospects, etiquette lessons, and family tradition. She approached the bar where a man with grey sideburns leaned close, his voice thick with the slow cadence of someone half-drifting. "First time?" he asked, offering a faint smile. Clara nodded. He gestured to a polished silver tray. Upon it lay several delicate handkerchiefs, each embroidered with gold thread. They looked harmless, beautiful even, but their edges were damp, with ether, liquid gleaming softly under the dim lights. "Choose one," the man said. "You'll forget the world for a while." Clara hesitated only a heartbeat. Then she lifted a handkerchief, its coolness startling her skin. Around her, laughter drifted slow, warm, muffled as though wrapped in cotton. Figures lounged on settees, their limbs draped gracefully, their conversations drifting in loose, unfinished threads. She inhaled. The world softened instantly. The lanterns shimmered. The laughter echoed with gentle sweetness. The velvet curtains seemed to ripple like water. Clara's heartbeat slowed, her breath deepening, until she felt herself floating away from the weight of her own name, her own lineage, her own future. Silas watched her from across the room, his gaze steady, unreadable. Another patron, an older woman with tear-streaked cheeks, fell gently asleep against the armrest of a chaise longue. A young man scribbled poetry that made sense only to him, then began to laugh at his own blurred handwriting. A pair of lovers collapsed into a dreamy embrace, their words dissolving into slurred whispers. No one judged, no one hurried, no one remained fully present. Time in the hollow did not pass in minutes or hours. It simply drifted, but beneath the warm haze, a truth lingered dark and patient. What soothed also consumed. What freed also bound. And though the club had no membership list, it had regulars' faces that returned nightly, drained by their lives above and sustained only by the sweetness below. Clara, drifting in her velvet seat, did not yet know she would become one of them. But Silas did. He always knew. For every soul who descended the stairs came seeking escape, and every one of them found it. Some never found their way back again. The fog lay thick over Camden that morning, pooling along the gutters and seeping through the cracks beneath shop doors, as though the city itself had exhaled a long, weary breath. Mr. Ambrose Holloway, undertaker of 32 years, unlocked the door to his mortuary with slow, deliberate movements, each step taken with the weight of ritual. His establishment always smelled of beeswax, lavender oil, and the faint mineral coldness of stone floors washed at dawn. But on this morning, a new scent clung to the air, soft, sweet, unmistakable. Ether. Ambrose paused at the threshold, nostrils flaring. He had smelled ether before at hospital wards, at emergency surgeries where the knife met flesh without a single scream, but never here. Never drifting through his mortuary like a visitor who had arrived early and unannounced. He set down his lantern, its glow trembling faintly, and moved deeper into the room. His assistant, young Timothy, was already there preparing the day's embalming tools, his face drawn and pale. "You're early," Ambrose murmured. Timothy swallowed hard. "Couldn't sleep, sir." Ambrose did not question him. Nights were long in their profession. Silence had a way of seeping into one's thoughts, settling in uncomfortable places. On the central table lay a body brought in late the night before, a young seamstress named Annie Whitlow, found lying as though peacefully asleep in her boarding house. No violence, no sign of illness. Simply stillness. Ambrose had seen sudden death before. He had prepared the bodies of men felled by strokes, women claimed by fever, infants taken by cold winter air. Yet something about Annie's face unsettled him. Her expression was serene, too serene. Her lips curved faintly upward, as though she had died in the middle of a dream she did not wish to leave. Timothy noticed it too. "Sir," he said softly, "she don't look like the others." Ambrose nodded grimly. "No, she does not." He lifted her hand gently, inspecting her fingers. No bruising, no rigidity, no struggle. Her skin was pale but not grey. Her pulse, when she had been measured the night before, had been faint, so faint the doctor declared life absent. But Ambrose had doubts. He always trusted his doubts. "Fetch the stethoscope," he instructed. Timothy blinked. "Sir, you think?" "Just fetch it." While the boy scrambled, Ambrose leaned closer to Annie's face. That scent lingered near her mouth, the same sweet, drifting sharpness he had smelled upon entering. Ether. He knew at once. Timothy returned, hands shaking slightly as he passed the stethoscope. Ambrose pressed the cold disc against Annie's chest. The silence inside her was immediate, cavernous, absolute, dead but not by nature's hand. Ambrose's jaw tightened. "Sir?" Timothy whispered. "Was it the ether?" Ambrose exhaled slowly. "Perhaps." He did not say aloud what he feared most, that many more like Annie were yet to come. He had heard the rumours sweeping through London of parlours sinking into dreamy chaos, of alleyways thick with drifting laughter, of mothers whispering of the sleeping medicine that brought both peace and peril. He had seen the way customers at the apothecary clutched their blue-labelled bottles like lifelines. He had even smelled it on the clothes of a gentleman he prepared last week, though he had dismissed it then as a medical oversight. Not anymore. He and Timothy worked in silence, preparing Annie with careful dignity. Yet every few minutes, Ambrose's gaze drifted toward her face, frozen in its faint smile. Ether had stolen her pain, and then it had stolen her breath. By midday, Ambrose stepped outside for air. The fog had thickened, carrying with it that faint medicinal sweetness once more. He watched people hurry past him, collars high, eyes weary. "Is this how it begins?" he murmured. A city numbed one breath at a time. As he returned inside, the bell over the mortuary door jingled. A boy from the constabulary entered, cap askew, cheeks flushed. "Another body, sir," he said breathlessly. "Young man. Same look as that one." He pointed to Annie. Ambrose closed his eyes. 2 in one day. He thought of Thomas the apothecary boy, of the swelling lines outside Mr. Coyle's shop, of the fog that now smelled strangely sweet. London was drifting slowly, quietly toward a place it might not return from. Ambrose Holloway, undertaker of 32 years, removed his gloves with a trembling hand. He had seen plagues, cold snaps, and tragedies of every shape. But this was different. This was a death that arrived smiling. And the city, unaware and unprepared, was inhaling deeply. Dr. Nathaniel Harrow had once prided himself on being unshakable. In the early days of his career, when blood pooled beneath surgical tables and patients groaned through procedures, he had learned to steady his hands and his mind with equal discipline. He had stood beside the great surgeons of the era, absorbing their precision, their brilliance, their resolve. But in those same years, before ether drifted out of medical journals and into common parlors, Nathaniel had also learned something far more dangerous. Pain was contagious. Not physically, no, but emotionally. Every cry wormed its way into the memory. Every desperate grasp left an imprint. Every night spent hovering over a patient who begged for mercy carved itself into the soul like a slow, unwelcome etching. And now, with London slipping into a chemical haze and his own patients draining the last of his strength, Nathaniel felt those old etchings burning again. His practice on Chancery Lane was modest but steady. He treated clerks with ink-stained wrists, seamstresses with needle-pricked fingers, and merchants whose lungs rattled with the coal dust of the docks. He knew their names, their families, their fears, and he knew that each one of them had begun whispering about the same thing. "Doctor, may I have a little ether? Just enough to sleep. Doctor, my nerves, they don't settle anymore. Doctor, everything feels heavy. That medicine lifts it for a moment." He always warned them, used sparingly, only for pain. He measured doses carefully. He set strict instructions, but they did not listen. And neither, soon enough, did he. It began on a night when the wind rattled the shutters like skeletal fingers tapping at the wood. Nathaniel sat at his desk long after the lamps should have been extinguished. Papers lay scattered, medical charts, unpaid bills, a letter from his sister asking why he hadn't visited in months. His head pounded with the familiar ache of exhaustion. His thoughts felt muddled, like words smeared across a page. A half-empty bottle of ether sat near the inkstand. He had opened it earlier to prepare an inhalation for a patient who had collapsed from a fever, but the patient had been rushed to the hospital instead, leaving the bottle uncorked on the desk. He should have closed it. Instead, he sat there, breathing it unconsciously, in slow, shallow sips that crept their way into his lungs. The sweetness softened the edges of the room. The shadows grew less imposing. The tightness in his chest unwound, thread by delicate thread. He knew the feeling well. He had seen it on patients' faces countless times, but he had never felt it himself. Not like this, not as a quiet invitation. Perhaps only a moment, he told himself, just enough to ease the headache, to clear his thoughts. He soaked a cloth, hesitating only briefly before lifting it toward his face. The scent enveloped him at once, icy and warm, sweet and sharp, contradictory in every exquisite way. His pulse slowed, his breath deepened, his thoughts floated like leaves on a still lake. For the first time in months, the noise in his mind fell silent. He sank back into the chair, feeling weightless, unburdened, almost whole. And then, just as quickly, the cloth slipped from his fingers. His head lolled to the side. The lamp's flame wavered like a tired sigh. He drifted. He forgot. He escaped. Hours later, he woke with a start, the lamp nearly burned out, his mouth tasting faintly of metal. Shame crept in before his mind was fully awake. He stared at the open bottle, horrified at what he had allowed himself to do. Doctors were meant to heal, not succumb. He sealed the bottle firmly and locked it in the cabinet. He washed his hands twice, as though the sensation lingered on his skin. He vowed it would never happen again. But the next night, the headache returned. The next morning, the exhaustion deepened. And the bottle's small, blue-labeled, patient waited. Within a week, he had justified 3 more doses. Within 2 weeks, 5. And by the end of the month, Nathaniel Harrow had joined the silent epidemic he was meant to fight. He still saw patients, still listened to their aches and fears, still offered them measured doses with stern warnings. But each time he inhaled ether to quiet his own unraveling mind, something inside him slipped further from reach. He told no one. He pretended nothing had changed. Yet every evening his steps toward the locked cabinet grew more certain, more automatic, more desperate. And London, already drifting on its own unsteady feet, did not notice the doctor who drifted with it. For in a city slowly drowning in sweetness, even the healers needed saving. Constable Rowan Briggs had walked the same beat along Whitechapel Road for nearly 12 years. He knew the rhythm of the district better than his own heartbeat. He recognized the vendors who rose before dawn, their breath fogging in the cold air as they set out their goods. He knew the street sweepers, the carriage drivers, the neighborhood boys who darted between stalls like sparrows. He knew the troublemakers too, the pickpockets with quick fingers, the gin-soaked brawlers who spilled into the street after midnight, the desperate souls who stole bread just to see another morning. But lately, the district felt different. Not louder, not more violent. Simply slower. People moved with a strange softness. Their voices drifted lazily. Their laughter came at odd moments, too light, too breathless. The fog smelled faintly of something unfamiliar, sweet, sharp, unsettling. And though Rowan had long believed he'd encountered every vice a Londoner could conjure, he now found himself facing a new one. Ether. He noticed it first among the dock workers who laboured along the river. Men who once staggered home with aching limbs now floated past him with glazed eyes, humming softly, forgetting to greet him despite years of habitual nods. Then came the seamstresses, stumbling through alleys with dreamy smiles, their fingers twitching as though sewing invisible threads. Children, too, children who should have been chasing marbles or shouting in the streets, sat in doorways swaying gently, their pupils wide and unfocused. At first, Rowan confronted them. "What's that cloth you're holding? Where'd you get that bottle? Has someone given you something you shouldn't have?" But each time, the answers were the same. "I don't remember. It helps me sleep. It's from the chemist. It makes everything softer." Softer. That word plagued him. London was grinding itself to pieces beneath the weight of industry and poverty. Hardship had sharpened its people, but ether was dulling them, blunting their fear, their pain, their instinct to survive. One evening, Rowan turned down Wicker Lane and saw two young men slumped against a brick wall, sharing a handkerchief damp with something that glimmered faintly under the gaslight. Their movements were slow, disjointed. Their laughter came in uneven bursts that died abruptly, leaving eerie silence behind. He approached. "You lads need to clear off," he said firmly. They looked up at him with soft, hazy smiles, utterly untroubled, utterly unaware of the danger they were in. "It's all right, Constable," one murmured. "Just a little ether. Helps the mind wander." Rowan's jaw tightened. He knew he should confiscate the cloth. He should escort them home. He should report them. But something in their faces stopped him, something fragile, something exhausted. These were boys who had grown up with hunger gnawing at them, with backbreaking work carving their youth away. Ether offered them a reprieve, however false. "Be on your way," he muttered, not sternly, but quietly. They nodded slowly, drifting to their feet, legs wobbling like newborn foals. As they staggered down the lane, Rowan remained rooted to the spot, guilt gnawing at him like an old wound. He had not done his duty. He had chosen mercy instead. But mercy had a cost. The next night, he found Mrs. Hensley, an elderly widow, collapsed on her stoop, a blue-labelled bottle clutched tightly in her hand. Her pulse fluttered like a trapped bird beneath his fingers. He carried her inside and placed her gently on her bed, hoping she would wake by morning. 2 nights later, a group of schoolboys were discovered asleep in a stable, ether-stained cloths scattered around them like fallen petals. And still, Rowan hesitated. He stopped reprimanding, stopped confiscating, stopped asking questions. He walked his beat with his eyes half open, not blinded, but choosing blindness. London was drowning in sweetness, and he alone could not stop the tide. One fog-heavy dawn, he paused outside the apothecary on Bishopsgate. A long line wrapped around the building, Men and women clutching coins with shaking hands as they waited for doors to open. Thomas, the errand boy, swept the doorstep, his young face drawn tight with worry. "Morning, Constable," Thomas whispered. "You're here early." "So are they," Rowan replied, nodding at the line. Thomas swallowed. "It's worse every day." Rowan stared at the restless crowd, at the trembling fingers, at the hollow eyes. He knew what he needed to do. He also knew he wouldn't do it. London was sick, and ether was both its medicine and its poison. Rowan Briggs, policeman of 12 years, walked on, not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much, and caring had become far more painful than pretending not to see. By early spring, the schoolhouse on Barlow Street had become a place of odd contradictions, children's laughter ringing through a yard that smelled faintly, impossibly, of a surgeon's room. At first it was only a whisper of scent drifting across the playground, carried on the cold wind between the brick walls and wooden fences. Miss Harriet Linton, the schoolmistress, noticed it before anyone else. She stood at the doorway each morning, ringing the old brass bell to gather her pupils, and on certain days, when the fog pressed low and the air hung heavy, she caught it unmistakably. A sweetness, a chill, a foreign sharpness. Ether. She wrinkled her nose the first time she smelled it, convinced it wafted in from one of the nearby workshops. But as the days passed, the scent seemed to linger, clinging to scarves, to mittened hands, to the very air the children exhaled. Miss Linton was not a woman prone to imagination. Her life had been shaped by discipline, straight-backed posture, precisely timed lessons, neatly inked attendance registers, and the steady patience of someone who believed education could mend the world's fractures. But no amount of discipline prepared her for the changes she began noticing among her pupils. It began with small things. Little Robert Phelps, usually restless and talkative, sat in a dreamy stupor during arithmetic, staring at his slate as though watching clouds drift across it. Two of the older girls giggled uncontrollably during handwriting practice, their laughter too airy, too strange, dissolving into nothing mid-breath, as though carried off by invisible currents. A boy named Stephen collapsed during morning drills, not with dramatic fainting, but with a soft, strange sinking, as if slipping into sleep while standing upright. His pulse fluttered weakly when Miss Linton felt for it. His breath smelled faintly sweet. She questioned him gently when he awoke. "What did you breathe in, Stephen? Did someone give you something?" His eyes were glassy, his voice thin. "Just a cloth. It helped me forget the cold." "A cloth from whom?" "I don't know." But Miss Linton suspected. At recess, children whispered in corners, forming tight huddles that dissolved when she approached. Some clutched small handkerchiefs like secret treasures. Others hid blue-labeled bottles in coat pockets, fumbling nervously whenever she cast her gaze their way. The schoolyard itself bore evidence of the spreading trend. In the far corner, near the broken section of the fence, she found strips of linen stained with a faint, familiar scent. Behind the gardening shed, she found a small cork. Near the gate, she discovered a crumpled paper wrapping with the words, "For restless nerves," stamped on it. Still, it was not until one wet morning in April that Miss Linton understood how deeply the danger had embedded itself. It happened during a spelling recitation. The children stood in neat rows, their voices rising in unison until one boy, Thomas Weaver, wavered mid-syllable. His knees buckled, his slate fell. Miss Linton caught him before he hit the floor. His breath carried the cold sweetness of ether. His fingers were limp. His eyes rolled back faintly. Her heart raced with a fear she had not known since childhood. "Where did you get it?" she demanded, her voice harsher than she intended. Thomas blinked, dazed. "The alley behind the bakery. A man gave it to us. Said it would make us float." "Us?" Her pulse pounded. "Who is us?" But the boy was already drifting into unconsciousness again. Panic spread through the classroom. Children murmured anxiously. Some covered their mouths, as if the scent might cling to them simply by being near. Others trembled with the knowledge that they, too, had breathed from the dampened cloth passed around among whispering friends. Miss Linton called for the constable Rowan Briggs, who arrived pale and solemn, already familiar with the spreading plague of sweetness. They carried Thomas to the infirmary together. He stirred only faintly, caught between waking and drifting. "This is worse than you know," Miss Linton said, her voice tight. "It's reached the children now." Rowan nodded grimly. "Aye, I feared as much." Outside, recess had resumed, nervous, subdued. The schoolyard, usually filled with shouts and darting feet, felt hollow. Even the fog seemed to hover lower, carrying that faint sweetness as though it were part of the school's breath. Miss Linton watched the children play with heavy dread. She had spent her life teaching them letters and numbers, shaping them to face the hardships of adulthood. But how could she shield them from a danger that drifted invisibly through the streets, passed along by careless hands, curious impulses, and the desperate hope of escape? She returned to the classroom later and found a handkerchief tucked beneath a desk. Faintly sweet, faintly cold, faintly deadly. Miss Harriet Linton sank into her chair, the cloth trembling in her hands. She felt the weight of a city losing its children one breath at a time. London's epidemic had reached its most fragile souls, and the schoolyard smelled unmistakably of medicine. The boarding house at number 42 Pelham Court had once been a place of warmth, threadbare, crowded, always a little draughty, but warm all the same. Its landlady, Mrs. Agnes Felbury, kept the lamps trimmed, the stair rails polished, and the hearth burning just enough to make the hallways feel lived in rather than lonely. Her tenants were a collection of clerks, seamstresses, travelling salesmen, and widowers who preferred a room with predictable rent over the uncertainty of family charity. For nearly 15 years, Agnes had run her boarding house with stern affection. She knew which tenants snored, which ones argued loudly enough to disturb the hall, and which ones hid overdue bills beneath their tea canisters. But not a single day in those 15 years had frightened her until the night the sweetness crept under her door. It began subtly, a faint, cold scent drifting up through the floorboards, curling into her sitting room like an unwelcome whisper. Agnes had been mending a hem when she noticed it, her needle pausing mid-air. She sniffed again, confused. It wasn't perfume, nor pipe smoke, nor the lavender oil she used to keep the moths away. It was sharper, stranger, a bit like the infirmary she visited once as a girl, a bit like something chemical trying to masquerade as pleasant. Ether. She stood quickly, her joints stiff, her breath unsettled. Following the scent, she climbed the stairs to the second floor, where 5 rooms lined a narrow corridor. As she reached the first door, she froze. Laughter spilled beneath it, light, drifting, entirely unlike the usual bickering she heard from her tenants. She knocked sharply. "Mr. Aldwin, are you quite all right in there?" The laughter stopped abruptly. Then came a muffled voice, dreamy and unconvincing. "Perfectly fine, Mrs. Felbury, just resting." She knew then something was wrong. She moved to the second door. More laughter, more drifting voices, someone humming off-key. The sweetness was stronger, now thick enough to make her eyes water. By the time she reached the end of the corridor, Agnes had already made her decision. She hurried downstairs, fetched her ring of spare keys, and returned with trembling hands. She unlocked the first door. The sight inside stopped her cold. Mr. Aldwin slumped across his bed, smiling vaguely at the ceiling. A half-empty vial of ether lay on the blanket beside him, its blue label glinting in the lamplight. A cloth dangled from his hand, damp and glistening. "Dear heavens," Agnes whispered. She dropped the keys and rushed to open the window, letting the cold night air pour in. The sweetness dispersed slightly, but it still clung to the walls like a stain. She checked the next room, then the next, and the next. Each one revealed the same tableau. Tenants drifting in blissful stupor, cloths scattered across floors, bottles rolling beneath beds, laughter dissolving into strange, thick silence. Her boarding house, her life's work, had become a den of chemical dreams. Agnes felt something twist painfully inside her chest. Not anger. Not yet. Fear. Ether had always been a rumor, a curiosity she heard whispered in markets and muttered about in the butcher shop queue. But she had never imagined it reaching her own doorstep, never imagined it finding its way into the rooms she scrubbed by hand, the halls she warmed, the lives she quietly tended to. She backed away from the corridor, clutching the banister. Something had to be done. Before dawn, Agnes Felbury had locked every door that did not lead to the street. She hammered shut the windows facing the alley where strange men lingered. She confiscated bottles where she could, her hands shaking as she dropped them into her apron, their cold touch lingering through the fabric. Her tenants awoke sluggishly one by one, confused, irritable. "Mrs. Felbury, why are the upstairs doors locked? This is outrageous. Let us into our rooms. You've no right to touch our belongings." But when she held up one of the blue-labeled bottles as evidence, they fell silent, guilty, ashamed, or too tired to protest. "Ether will not turn my house into a tomb," she said quietly, her voice breaking and hardening at the same time. "Not while I draw breath." Still, some of them looked at the confiscated bottles with longing rather than regret. And Agnes saw it. The craving, the pull, the soft, dangerous promise still clinging to their lungs. That night, she slept in her chair by the front door, heavy iron keys in her apron pocket. The sweetness had finally faded from the corridors, but Agnes knew it would return. She knew temptation would find its way back, as surely as fog found its way through London's streets. Ether did not knock politely. It seeped. It crept. It returned. The landlady who locked her doors understood this better than anyone. And as she sat watch beneath the dim glow of her hearth, Agnes Felbury whispered to herself, "I can bar the doors, but I cannot bar the air." Outside, the fog thickened again, carrying with it that soft, chemical sweetness. Her fear deepened. The city's drifting only grew worse. It began with a restlessness no one could quite explain, an unease that moved through London like an invisible current. By dusk, the lamps flickered oddly, their flames bending as though disturbed by a breath no one felt. The fog arrived earlier than expected, rolling in from the river in thick, silvery sheets. It pressed against windows, swallowed alleyways, and blurred the line between evening and night. But the strangest thing was not the fog. It was the silence, a silence too heavy for a city that never slept. Constable Rowan Briggs noticed it first as he walked his beat. The usual symphony of London, the creaking carts, the shouts of vendors, the arguments spilling from tavern doors had softened into something muted, sluggish. Even the horses stood unusually still, their ears twitching nervously at the odd weight in the air. Then Rowan smelled it. Faint, sweet, cold, ether. He had grown accustomed to catching its scent in alleys and cramped homes, but tonight it drifted openly through the streets, riding the fog like a passenger. It seeped beneath closed doors. It lingered beneath the street lamps. It wrapped itself around the city with a quiet, eerie insistence. The first sign of trouble came near Bishopsgate, where Rowan found a cluster of people standing motionless beneath a lamp, eyes glazed, bodies swaying slightly, as if caught mid-dream with their feet still on the cobblestones. "Are you all right?" he called gently. No one answered. One woman blinked slowly, her mouth curling into a faraway smile. A man beside her let out a soft, drifting laugh that faded before it reached Rowan's ears. He felt dread bloom beneath his ribs. Down the street, Mrs. Prim, the ribbon seller, sat slumped against her stall, humming quietly to herself. The shutters of the apothecary were rattling, though the building was dark inside. A carriage driver had fallen asleep on his seat, reins still in hand, his horse staring into the fog with frightened, glassy eyes. It was as though the whole city had been dipped in ether. On Fleet Street, lamps swayed in the night breeze. Shutters cracked open to reveal dim rooms where families sat awake, pupils dilated, unable to sleep despite exhaustion weighing down their limbs. In one home, a mother rocked her baby with mechanical rhythm, murmuring a lullaby that sounded more like a chant. Her husband sat nearby, head lolling, muttering to himself about feeling light as smoke. In another, a seamstress lay on her bed staring at the ceiling, the walls around her tilting gently as though the house were at sea. On Ludgate Hill, men staggered along the pavement with the dazed smiles of children, appearing lost but untroubled. Women leaned against walls, fingers twitching as though plucking invisible strings. In the churchyard, a group of young men laughed at nothing at all, collapsing into the grass like puppets whose strings had loosened. Ether's reach had grown. Tonight, it ruled. Even the Thames seemed to breathe differently. The water moved sluggishly, reflecting distorted lamplight like ribbons of pale gold. The fog hovering above it thickened, pulling the sweet scent toward the bridges and wharves. People wandered in a half-dream, some humming, others speaking to no one in particular. London was awake, but no one was truly conscious. Miss Harriet Linton, the schoolmistress, stood at her window clutching the sill with shaking hands as she watched neighbours drift through the street like sleepwalkers. A cloth with ether stains lay forgotten on her doorstep, dropped, perhaps, by one of her own students earlier that day. She whispered a prayer she could barely remember the words to. Dr. Nathaniel Harrow, hunched over his desk, stared at the locked cabinet where he had hidden his own ether bottle. He heard laughter drifting through the streets and fought the temptation to open it. His hands trembled violently. Agnes Felbury, the landlady, sat guarding her boarding-house door, listening to her tenants giggle in their rooms despite her best efforts to confiscate every bottle she found. In the shadows of Covent Garden, patrons spilled out of the hollow, not drunk, not ill, but drifting in that soft, delirious state peculiar to those who inhaled too deeply. They sat along the steps of the flower shop above the club, staring at the sky as though waiting for dawn to arrive like a revelation. But dawn did not come quickly. The fog refused to lift. The city refused to sleep. And somewhere in the distance, echoing faintly through the haze, someone began to cry. A slow, aching wail that rose and fell like the tide. Rowan Briggs paused mid-step, trying to locate its source, but the fog swallowed sound and shape alike. This night would be remembered. The night London stayed awake, but not awake in any way that mattered. The night the city forgot to sleep, because it had drifted too far into a sweetness that numbed everything it touched. And as the church bells rang weakly through the ether-thick air, Rowan understood with perfect clarity. This was no longer a series of incidents. This was an epidemic, and London had already inhaled too deeply to turn back. St. Winifred's Church sat at the corner of Briarwick Lane, a modest brick building with a sagging roof and a bell that rang slightly off-key. It was not a grand cathedral, nor a fashionable parish. Its congregation was made up of dockworkers, widows, seamstresses, factory boys, and a handful of weary families who clung to Sunday sermons the way drowning men cling to driftwood. And presiding over them all was Reverend Samuel Harworth, a man whose gentle voice had comforted the district for nearly 2 decades. In the pulpit, Samuel was unwavering. His words carried the steadiness of a man who believed deeply in mercy, in forgiveness, in the quiet resilience of the human spirit. But outside the pulpit, behind closed doors in the dim vicarage, Samuel's spirit was anything but steady. He had not always been this way. There was a time when prayer steadied him, when scripture soothed him, When grief found balm in faith rather than fracture. But then came the winter after his wife's passing, when loneliness sank its claws into him like a frost that refused to melt. His nights grew long, his sleep grew thin. His heart, already bruised by loss, began to crack beneath the weight of unspoken sorrow. The parish doctor, meaning only kindness, had given him a small bottle to ease his nerves. "A few drops when sleep won't come," the doctor said, "safe in the proper measure." The blue-labelled bottle had sat untouched for days, then weeks. Then, one night, when grief pressed too heavily on his ribcage, Samuel uncorked it. The sweetness drifted through the room. His pulse softened. His thoughts grew misty. He slept. But peace purchased from a bottle lasts only as long as the bottle remains full. Now, months later, the bottle had become his most guarded secret. It lived inside the drawer of his writing desk, hidden beneath letters from parishioners and the small silver cross his late wife once wore. Samuel carried its weight like a stone in his pocket, not physically, but in the conscience he could no longer silence. He told himself it was not a sin to seek rest. He told himself he needed clarity to help his flock. He told himself he was not like those who wandered the fog-stained streets in chemical stupor. But each time he inhaled the faint sweetness from the cloth, each time he drifted into that soft, unthinking realm, shame whispered louder. On this particular evening, the church was empty except for the reverend, who stood near the altar lighting candles for the twilight service. The flames flickered weakly, their glow blurred slightly as Samuel blinked against the haze clouding his mind. He had used the ether again that afternoon, only a little. He told himself just enough to steady the shaking in his hands after consoling a mother who feared her son had overdosed on the very same substance. The irony was cruel. He sank onto a pew, elbows on his knees, hands clasped beneath his chin. "Lord," he whispered, "give me strength to stop." But the air still smelled faintly of ether, sweet, cold, a scent that seemed to stroke the edges of his weariness like a familiar hand. A knock sounded at the church doors. Samuel rose slowly, pulling his coat tighter around him before unlocking the entrance. On the threshold stood Mrs. Langley, a widow whose husband had succumbed to illness years prior. Her eyes were wet with fear. "Reverend," she said breathlessly, "it's my eldest. He's drifting. I can't wake him proper. Please come." Samuel's stomach dropped. Ether again. Always ether. He grabbed his coat and followed her through the fog-choked streets to her cramped tenement. Inside, her son lay on the bed, eyes half open, breathing slow, lips parted in a faint smile that chilled Samuel's blood. The scent in the room was unmistakable. "Has he taken anything else?" Samuel asked. Mrs. Langley shook her head helplessly. "No, Reverend, only that cloth his friends passed around. Said it made them forget their hunger." Forget. That was the word that clung to Samuel. Forgetfulness had become the city's sweetest temptation. He knelt beside the boy, checking breath and pulse, murmuring words of comfort he could no longer fully feel. As he worked, his own hands trembled not with fear for the boy, but with the realization that he, too, knew the allure of disappearing into that drifting quiet. When the crisis had eased and the boy stirred faintly, Samuel returned to the church. He walked straight to the vicarage, straight to the desk, straight to the drawer where the blue bottle waited. He held it up to the lamplight. The liquid shimmered. Sweetness rose. Temptation curled around him like a soft fog. He closed his eyes. Then, with a shuddering breath, he hurled the bottle into the fireplace. The glass shattered. The flames hissed as ether ignited in a burst of pale blue fire. The room filled with a sharp vapor that dissipated quickly, leaving only smoke and the lingering echo of broken addiction. Samuel sank into a chair, face in his hands. He had destroyed the bottle, but he had not destroyed the craving, nor the shame. In the silence of the vicarage, he whispered a prayer not for his congregation, but for himself. Lord, help me stand when the whole city is drifting. Outside, the fog thickened once more, carrying with it that sweet, dangerous promise London had already inhaled far too deeply. By late spring, the factory on Millwright Road had become a monument to exhaustion. Its brick walls, stained with soot and years of grim industry, rattled day and night beneath the relentless clatter of machinery. Inside, the air quivered with heat, steam, and the ceaseless groan of metal pressed against metal. Men and women worked in long rows, their faces pale beneath the harsh gas lamps, faces drawn tight with fatigue, hands raw from labor that offered too little rest and too many hours. At the head of it all stood Mr. Horace Wellingford, owner and overseer. His reputation was well known: stern, precise, demanding. He ran the factory with a strictness that bordered on cruelty, but he was also known for one curious trait: he never appeared tired. While his workers slumped in exhaustion, Horace stood tall, alert, almost unnervingly composed. They whispered that he slept very little. They whispered that he never slowed down. They whispered quietly that the devil himself fueled the man's stamina. But the truth was far quieter and far more dangerous. On the top floor of the factory, behind a locked oak door that no worker had ever passed through, lay a small, windowless room. The air inside was cool, still, and smelled faintly of two things: pressed linen and ether. A single lamp sat on a writing desk, its flame permanently turned low. In the corner stood a velvet chair, where Horace often sat in the late hours after the machinery fell silent. And beside the chair, always beside it, stood a small table with a blue-labeled bottle resting at its center like a sacred relic. He had discovered ether half a year earlier, during a surgery for a crushed hand. The surgeon had draped a cloth over his face, whispering, "Breathe deeply, Mr. Wellingford. We'll begin when you are at ease." And then he drifted away from pain, away from anxiety, away from the burden of a failing factory caught in the grind of London's insatiable appetite for production. When he awoke, the pain returned, but something else did too: a memory of that floating quiet, the soft sweetness that had seemed, in that brief hour, like freedom. Since then, he used it sparingly, or so he told himself. Only when the pressure mounted, only when sleep refused to come, only when the accounts failed to balance, or the workers threatened to strike, or the machines broke for the third time in a week. Only in moments of necessity. But necessity had become increasingly frequent. On this particular night, after the workers had finally filed out and the machines had gone still, Horace climbed the steps to his secret room, his boots heavy on the iron stairs. The fog outside pressed thickly against the factory windows, and even up here he could smell the faint sweetness drifting through the city. He locked the door behind him. His hands trembled not with fear, but anticipation. He soaked a cloth, watching the liquid glisten in the lamplight. As it touched the fabric, the scent rose gently, curling through the air like a ghostly ribbon. He pressed the cloth to his face. The sweetness enveloped him instantly. His muscles loosened. His heartbeat slowed. The oppressive weight of responsibility slid from his shoulders. He sank into the velvet chair and closed his eyes. For a few precious moments, the world softened. The machines below seemed distant, like waves crashing on a faraway shore. The ledgers no longer felt like chains. The workers' complaints, the investor demands, the looming debts, all blurred into gentle nothingness. He drifted. But drifting has consequences. Downstairs, two workers, Martha Hingley and Jonah Reed, had remained behind to finish cleaning a jammed loom. When they passed the stairwell that led to Horace's private floor, they heard something strange: a faint laugh, a slow, eerie, drifting laugh. They stopped cold. "Did you hear that?" Martha whispered. Jonah frowned. "Who's up there? No one's allowed on the top floor." Another laugh, weak, dreamy, unsettling. They exchanged a look of dread. Together, they climbed a few steps, pausing when the scent reached them. Sweet, cold, familiar in the way rumors make things familiar. Ether, Martha whispered. Jonah swallowed hard. But why? A sudden thud interrupted him, the sound of a body sinking heavily into furniture. Martha gasped. "We need to get someone," she said. "Something's wrong." Horace, now half-conscious and sinking deeper into the drifting haze, heard none of it. His mind floated far from the world he controlled so fiercely. By the time the workers fetched help, it was nearly too late. Horace had slipped into a dangerous depth of Ether's embrace. The doctor who arrived whispered angrily under his breath. Fool. He inhaled too much. The factory owner, feared by workers and respected by investors, now looked fragile, small, even as he lay limp in his velvet chair. When he finally woke hours later, his workers were gone. The doctor was gone. The fog outside had begun to lift. But Horace Wellingford understood something with chilling clarity. He had crossed a line. Ether no longer belonged to the workers alone. It had claimed him too, and in that secret room where sweetness clung to every shadow, he whispered into the stillness, "I need it. God, help me. I need it." Justice Hall on Kingswood Street had once been a place of crisp order, pounded gavels, rattling chains, clerks hurrying with ink-stained fingers, the constant shuffle of defendants, witnesses, and constables passing beneath its tall archways. The building itself, with its imposing stone façade and echoing corridors, seemed built for clarity and certainty. But nothing in London remained untouched by the drifting sweetness that now haunted the city. Not even the law. Magistrate Alistair Pennington prided himself on having a mind like a sharpened blade. In his earlier years, he was famed for swift judgments and an unyielding sense of moral duty. Pennington sees through fog, the newspapers once proclaimed, praising his ability to unravel lies with surgical precision. But that had been before the long nights of paperwork that never seemed to end, before the headaches that tightened like iron bands around his skull, before the sleeplessness, before a colleague, well-meaning, sympathetic, placed a small blue-labeled bottle in his hand. "Just for the nerves," the colleague whispered, "only when absolutely needed." Ether. At first, Alistair resisted, but the pressure on him was relentless, cases piling higher than the courthouse rafters, public unrest simmering in the streets, crime swelling as fog and desperation deepened. He worked late into the night, burning candles to stubs, feeling every judgment weigh upon him as though the city itself leaned against his shoulders. One night, exhausted and trembling, he uncorked the bottle. The scent wrapped around him like a soft glove, sweet, cold, strangely gentle. His breath slowed, his thoughts softened. Sleep came swiftly, like a benediction. And so a habit began, small and quiet. But habits grow. Tonight, Justice Hall brimmed with restless bodies as the magistrate took his seat. The courtroom lamps flickered, casting uncertain light upon the faces watching him. A pickpocket stood at the front, hands clasped tightly. A seamstress accused of striking her employer trembled beside her solicitor. A drunken brawler glared defiantly from behind the constable restraining him. Alistair blinked slowly. The room wavered at the edges ever so slightly. He rubbed his temples. He had inhaled only a little that morning, telling himself it would sharpen him, steady him, clear the mist of exhaustion. But ether did not sharpen. It blurred. It softened. It reversed the very clarity he relied upon. The solicitor approached. "Your worship, shall we begin?" Alistair nodded, or thought he did. For a moment, the solicitor's voice stretched strangely, as though drifting through water. The pickpocket spoke next, but the magistrate heard only fragments. "Never meant, sir. Hungry. Didn't think." He tried to focus. His mind slipped like a hand on wet stone. "Repeat that," he murmured, his fingers gripping the bench. The seamstress began to testify. Her voice trembled, but her words made sense until they didn't. Suddenly her face seemed too pale, her outline too soft, her eyes too bright. The courtroom blurred again. The lamps flared strangely. "Your worship?" she asked timidly. "Shall I continue?" Alistair opened his mouth, but no sound came. He felt the gazes of dozens of people fixed on him. He cleared his throat, heart pounding. "Yes," he managed. "Proceed." But she hadn't asked anything requiring confirmation. Confusion rippled through the room. Whispers spread. "Is he all right?" "He looks ill. He's struggling to follow." A constable stepped forward. "Your worship, perhaps a recess." "No," Alistair snapped, though the words slurred faintly. "No. I'm perfectly able." He wasn't. He called for the next witness too soon, cutting off the seamstress mid-sentence. He misread a statement, mistaking a date for a name. He overturned his own earlier ruling within minutes. His gavel struck the bench unevenly, echoing like a broken metronome. And then, worst of all, as the pickpocket pled for clemency voice raw with sincerity, Alistair stared directly at him and heard absolutely nothing. The room fell away. The lamps dimmed. The courtroom blurred into a warm, drifting haze. Someone gasped. Someone else whispered his name. Alistair Pennington realized, in that horrifying moment, that he had forgotten he was presiding over court at all. The constable stepped forward, firm hand on the magistrate's shoulder. "Your worship, you must rest." The courtroom erupted into murmurs. Alistair stood shakily, gripping the bench as though it were the only solid thing in the world. His vision swam. Faces warped. Words tangled. He managed one sentence before he fled the hall. "Adjourn until further notice." Outside, the fog curled around him like a taunt, carrying with it that same sweet scent he had tried so desperately to use sparingly. Now it owned him. As he staggered toward his carriage, he could hear the whispers rising behind him. The magistrate's losing his senses. Ether has to be. Justice will suffer for this. For the first time in his career, Alistair Pennington felt the terrifying truth. He could no longer trust his own mind. And in a city drifting deeper into chemical fog, the law itself had begun to drift with it. Lady Evelyn Harwood had always been the jewel of Mayfair society, poised, admired, whispered about with envy behind fluttering fans and clinking teacups. She moved through drawing rooms with effortless grace, her gowns trailing silk and soft perfume. Her laughter, light, well-timed, carefully modulated, was the music of London's most coveted gatherings. She occupied a world built on ceremony, expectation, and unspoken rules embedded deeper than the stitching of her corsets. But even jewels crack beneath enough pressure, and Mayfair had its own kind of cruelty. Behind the elegant façade of her life lay a quiet misery. Her husband, Lord Edmund Harwood, was a cold, exacting man who measured worth by lineage and reputation. He expected perfection from Eveline, flawless conversation, flawless posture, flawless silence when his temper rose. She bore the weight without complaint until the headaches began. They came sharp and sudden, like shards of glass behind her eyes. Doctors prescribed rest. Friends recommended lavender sachets and cool compresses. Maids whispered superstitions. Nothing helped. Then one evening, during a dinner party at the Calthorpe estate, Eveline saw something that changed everything. A fainting spell had overtaken one of the guests, and the host's physician administered ether with practiced ease. Eveline watched the vapor's effect, the woman's tension dissolving, her features softening, her breathing slowing into something blissfully serene. Eveline had never seen peace look so complete. She asked the physician about it afterward, voice quiet, eyes bright with desperation. He warned her of its dangers, but she heard only the promise hidden in the sweetness. Within days, she had obtained her own blue-labeled bottle. It began with a small inhalation before tea, then another before bed, then another in the middle of sleepless nights. By the end of the month, she carried a perfumed handkerchief in her sleeve, its embroidery masking its more secret purpose. Tonight, her downfall began. The Harwoods were hosting a soirée, nearly 50 guests filling their home with chatter, lace, and candlelight. Musicians played softly in the gallery. Servants glided between rooms carrying trays of wine and petite fours. Lord Edmund held court with his peers, discussing politics with his usual mixture of aloofness and arrogance. Lady Eveline stood near the hearth in the drawing-room, smiling politely as two friends prattled on about an upcoming ball. But their voices melted into a dull hum, drowned by the relentless pounding in her skull. Her vision wavered, her palms dampened. Silently, she slipped from the room. Upstairs in her private sitting room, she unlocked the ivory box hidden beneath her writing desk. The bottle waited like a confidant, gleaming softly beneath the lamplight. "Just a breath," she whispered, "only enough to steady myself." The cloth touched her face. The sweetness enveloped her like a warm veil. Her pulse slowed. Her thoughts loosened. The world softened at the edges. She sank into her chaise, sinking deeper into that drifting, weightless realm. But time continued without her. When she failed to return to the party, Lord Edmund grew irritated. When a guest asked for her, irritation became suspicion. When a servant confessed to seeing her ascend the stairs alone, suspicion turned to rage. He stormed into her sitting room. "Eveline." He stopped short. There she lay, draped across the chaise in a half-collapsed posture of unnatural serenity. Her hand dangled toward the floor. The handkerchief lay near her feet, and the scent, sweet, icy, unmistakable, hung in the room like a confession. For a moment, Edmund was struck dumb. Ether in his house, in the hands of his wife. Shame struck him harder than grief. He called for the servants, but with no gentleness. They rushed in, horrified to see the lady of the house unconscious, breathing faintly, cheeks flushed with dangerous calm. Women whispered in corners. Men muttered disapproval. Guests below murmured uneasily as rumors spread with the speed of fire. By the time Eveline awoke, disoriented, trembling, the house had already turned against her. Edmund stood stiffly by the window, arms crossed. "You've disgraced us," he said coldly. "The entire neighborhood will know by morning." Tears blurred her sight. "I only wished to feel quiet, just for a moment." "There will be no more moments," he snapped. "You'll remain confined until I decide what to do with you." But Eveline was not ashamed, not in the way he meant. Her shame was quieter, deeper, that the only peace she had found in years was the peace that nearly killed her. The next day, society had its newest scandal. Lady Harwood collapses at own soirée, chemical intoxication suspected. Ether's reach expands into aristocratic circles. Women clucked their tongues, men shook their heads, and London learned something unsettling. Even the finest drawing rooms were not safe from the sweetness drifting through the city. Lady Eveline Harwood had fallen from grace, not with a scream, but with a breath. The Whitcomb brothers had once been known across Lambeth for their closeness, a pair of inseparable shadows moving in perfect rhythm through childhood mischief, adolescence ambition, and the early struggles of adulthood. Thomas, the elder by 2 years, was steady and thoughtful, a shoemaker with a careful hand and a sensitive ear for clients' troubles. Daniel, bright-eyed and impulsive, worked as a messenger, his quick feet weaving through London's streets like a darting sparrow. Where Thomas was still water, Daniel was the wind that rippled it. Where Daniel lost his temper, Thomas soothed him. Where Thomas doubted himself, Daniel cheered him on. They lived together in a cramped but tidy room above a cobbler's shop, and shared their meager earnings with the easy trust of brothers who believed their bond unbreakable. But nothing remained untouched by the sweetness seeping into London. The first shift in their relationship came quietly, small cracks that neither recognized at first. Thomas noticed Daniel returning home later than usual, his steps unsteady, his laughter strangely delayed. The scent clung to him, a cold, chemical sweetness threaded through his clothes. "Where have you been?" Thomas asked one night, trying to sound casual. "Out," Daniel replied, shrugging with a lazy smile. "Just having a bit of fun." "Fun?" Thomas frowned. "You smell like something from a surgeon's room." Daniel laughed too loudly. "Everyone's trying it, Tom. Just a bit of ether helps you float." Thomas's stomach dropped. He'd heard whispers. He'd seen customers come into the shop with glazed eyes and too gentle smiles. He'd watched good men drift into dangerous stillness. "Daniel, it isn't safe," he whispered. But Daniel waved him off. "Safer than the gin you won't stop lecturing me about." A joke meant lightly, but it stung. The next days widened the divide. Daniel stopped eating regularly, claiming he wasn't hungry. He forgot errands, misdelivered packages, lost track of time. Thomas tried reason, then pleading, then anger. Nothing reached him. "Just stop for a week," Thomas begged one night. "Please, for me." Daniel stared back, pupils wide, smile faint. "Why? It's the only thing that makes anything bearable." Thomas felt something crack inside him. The breaking point came on a fog-soaked evening when the factory whistles had long fallen silent and the streets were thick with drifting shadows. Thomas returned home early from the shop, a rare half-day granted by a kindly customer. The lamp in their room flickered weakly. Daniel was there, unconscious, ether cloth still in hand. Thomas froze, breath shuddering. He rushed to his brother's side, shaking him gently, then harder, too hard. "Daniel, Daniel, wake up." Silence. Then, at last, a faint inhale, a soft, eerie laugh escaping Daniel's lips like a dream slipping through cracked glass. Thomas nearly wept with relief. But something inside him fractured beyond repair. He took the cloth, the bottle, the handkerchief. He threw them out of the window with a cry that startled the neighbors. Daniel lurched awake in panic. "Why would you do that?" he shouted, voice raw. "It was mine." "It was killing you," Thomas shouted back. "Killing me?" Daniel laughed bitterly. "I'm already half dead, Thomas. The world sees to that well enough." Thomas staggered back, stunned. "Don't say that." Daniel stood, swaying, eyes bright with anger and drifting sweetness. "You don't understand anything," he hissed. "You never have." Thomas stared at the brother he had raised, defended, loved. "Daniel," he whispered, "you're not yourself." But Daniel only grabbed his coat and stormed out into the fog-soaked night, the door slamming hard enough to rattle the panes. He did not return the next day, nor the next, nor the next. Word drifted in fragments. Daniel seen in Harrow Mill Alley, Daniel in the company of drifters, Daniel inhaling in dark corners, Daniel laughing uncontrollably beneath a dim lamp. Each rumour stabbed Thomas deeper. Their room grew quiet. Their meals went untouched. Their shared life unravelled like thread left near a flame. One evening, as Thomas closed the shop, he saw a shadow leaning against the far wall. Daniel, thinner now, face hollow, eyes too soft. "Tom," he murmured, "I came back." Thomas's heart leapt, but only for a second. Daniel swayed, barely conscious. And the smell, the sweetness rolled off him in waves. Thomas's face hardened. "I can't help you," he whispered. Daniel blinked slowly, as if hearing the words through fog. He nodded once, an acceptance or a surrender. Then he turned and disappeared into the night, swallowed by fog and sweetness. The Whitcomb brothers did not speak again. Their bond, once unbreakable, had dissolved not with anger, not with betrayal, but with a breath of ether. A sweetness London had begun to mistake for salvation. The office of the Daily Chronicle had always thrived on urgency, chaos, and the clatter of printing presses. The ink-stained floors, the towering stacks of type, and the constant hum of wheels and gears lent the place a rhythm that reporters, editors, and compositors followed like a second heartbeat. Deadlines loomed constantly, and the city's news never waited for tired minds. But on this particular spring morning, something in the building moved differently, slower, softer, more uncertain. Something carried the unmistakable, drifting scent that had begun to haunt London. Ether. It arrived quietly, carried in the sleeves of delivery boys, the folds of borrowed coats, the hands of clerks who had wandered the fog-laden streets too long. First noticed by Mr. Percival Lark, a young compositor with ink under his fingernails and hollowed eyes, the scent curled around his nose as he set type for the early edition. It was subtle, sweet, cold, intoxicating, but it lingered, carrying a pull he did not wish to resist. Percival shook his head and tried to focus. He had a lead to print, and he needed clarity. But the memory of a single inhalation lingered. His fingers trembled as the scent tickled his throat. Around him, others were not so resistant. Margaret Ellison, a typist with a sharp tongue and sharper wit, had taken the cloth discreetly behind her desk and inhaled, eyes half closed. She swayed slightly, laughing softly at nothing, fingers drumming against the papers as though keeping time with an invisible conductor. The ink seemed to blur beneath her touch. Mr. Fenton, the city editor, noticed immediately. He had once been a young man of precision, a hawk-eyed arbiter of deadlines, but even he paused, sniffing the air, frowning. His assistants, too, seemed different, movements slower, voices soft and uncertain, the air thick with a chemical weight he could neither name nor chase away. The first sign of disruption came when a letter from a prominent reader, a complaint regarding a recent report on a dockside accident, was misplaced. The typesetter, slouched over his desk, had been too distracted, swaying slightly, lips parted in faint, distracted laughter. Percival realized only when the printing press began to churn the wrong columns into the first edition. Panic rippled through the office. Pages were misaligned, headlines mismatched. The usual crisp order dissolved into a chaos, punctuated by stifled giggles and drifting murmurs. A meeting was called. Fenton banged his fists on the desk, attempting to summon authority that seemed as ephemeral as the fog beyond the windows. "Everyone present their reports," he barked. Voices murmured, soft, almost musical, but not coherent. Papers shuffled, eyes glazed. Margaret leaned against the wall, humming faintly, while a compositor forgot the typeface entirely, scribbling letters with a trembling hand. Percival felt his thoughts drift, one moment aware of the meeting, the next slipping as though he were a passenger in a boat carried slowly down a river of sweetness. Fenton's glare fell upon him. "Percival, are you listening?" "Yes, sir," Percival stammered. Yet he had not heard a word. The words of his colleagues merged into a low hum, dissolving in the chemical haze. Outside, London's fog pressed against the windows. Gas lamps flickered, their halos warping as though the city itself were breathing with the office. The scent of ether drifted in and out of the building, unbound, inevitable. By the afternoon, the first edition printed incorrectly, the error glaring across the city's morning tables. Letters of complaint arrived almost immediately, carried by boys whose coats carried the same faint sweetness. Rumors began, whispers of a distracted editorial staff, a newspaper office losing its grip on clarity. Fenton paced the office, hands in his hair. "This is impossible," he muttered. "How can it be that a building filled with capable men and women has lost itself?" Margaret Ellison, swaying slightly near the corner, giggled softly. "It's just easier this way," she murmured. Fenton froze. The The scent curling about her seemed alive, bending attention, softening resistance, pulling the office further into a drift that no discipline could halt. Percival looked around, watching the office dissolve into quiet chaos, and realized something terrifying. Ether had entered the engine of information, and for a city that relied on clarity and order, the consequences were only beginning. Outside, the fog pressed heavier. Inside, the press rolled endlessly, printing a reality already softened by sweetness. London had witnessed its first scandal in chemical influence, and the city would remember it, though most would not know the source. The lecture hall at St. Bartholomew's Medical College was unusually silent that morning, save for the faint rustle of parchment and the occasional cough echoing across polished oak benches. The air was thick with anticipation, damp from the lingering fog outside, and scented faintly with chalk dust and antiseptic herbs. Students had gathered to witness what was promised as a groundbreaking demonstration, the efficacy of ether as a surgical anesthetic, a marvel of modern medicine that promised to render pain almost non-existent. Dr. Aldrich Wainwright, tall and composed, moved to the front of the hall, his footsteps soft but purposeful. Behind him, a small table bore the instruments of the trade, scalpels gleaming under the gaslight, polished forceps, and, at the center, a single blue-labeled bottle. The vial was modest, unassuming, yet the room seemed to bend toward it. Its presence alone drew the eye, curling the senses as if inviting the audience to inhale before the first demonstration. "Gentlemen," Wainwright began, his voice smooth, deliberate, "today you shall observe a new era in surgical practice. A substance has been discovered, carefully measured, carefully administered, that allows relief from pain hitherto considered inevitable." A hush fell over the students, notebooks poised, pens trembling. They leaned forward, eager to witness a miracle. Some had heard rumors of ether's power, whispered in dim hospital corridors and along fogged streets. They had expected science, they had expected precision, they had not expected unease. Wainwright lifted the cloth lightly from the table, allowing the faint scent to drift upward. Sweet, cold, subtly sharp, it curled toward the noses of the students, teasing the edges of attention, tugging at their focus in a way that none yet realized. The effect was immediate. A few leaned back involuntarily, blinking against a sudden dizziness. One young man coughed softly, though his eyes were wide with fascination. Another smiled faintly, a dreamy flush coloring his cheeks. Wainwright noticed, but he continued. The procedure began. A volunteer patient, a young man with a minor laceration from a workshop accident, was brought forward. The assistant, trained carefully by Wainwright, held the cloth over the man's face, allowing him to inhale the vapor. A soft sigh escaped the patient's lips. His body slackened. His eyes, once wide with apprehension, grew distant. He drifted into a pale, weightless calm that held the room captive. But as the demonstration progressed, the subtle undercurrent of unease grew. Several students whispered to one another, faces tense despite the apparent success of the anesthetic. The sweetness in the air seemed to thicken, curling around their thoughts like smoke. Hands shook just enough to betray their composure, pens scrawling lines that made no sense. Some felt the momentary pull of the vapor themselves, a dizzying tug towards something dangerously serene. "Observe," Wainwright said, moving with deliberate calm. "Notice the patient's vitals, the slowing pulse, the relaxation of muscle tension. This is the future of surgery." Yet the more he spoke, the more uneasy the room became. The scent, soft, insidious, lingered beyond the patient, stretching into the hall, invading lungs, loosening minds. A few students leaned against the walls, heads nodding too slowly, as if caught mid-thought, mid-awareness. One young man murmured, almost to himself, "I feel lighter, so much lighter," before catching his own words with a flush of embarrassment. Wainwright's brow furrowed imperceptibly. He had anticipated wonder, not disorientation. He had predicted fascination, not drift. Ether, he realized, had a reach that extended beyond the patient. It touched the observers, curling through the room in invisible tendrils, softening nerves, loosening perception, tugging at the edges of attention with a dangerous sweetness. By the end of the demonstration, the lecture hall was transformed. Eyes were glassy, movements slowed, pens had fallen idle. Notes were half-formed, slurred by distraction. Students whispered to themselves, murmuring fragments of words they could no longer fully comprehend. The promise of medical advancement was undeniable, but so too was the danger that lingered behind every breath of the vapor. Wainwright stepped back, silent. His heart thudded against the ribs, not for the patient, but for the room. The lecture had succeeded, technically, yet the unease remained. Ether had proved itself a marvel and a menace. He had hoped to teach them science, but the hall had inhaled something far older, far more dangerous, the soft, seductive pull of forgetting. London would carry this lesson far beyond the college walls, drifting invisibly into homes, alleys, and hearts alike. The factory on Cranbrook Lane had been alive with the clatter of machinery long before dawn. Steam hissed from pipes, metal groaned under relentless pressure, and the familiar rhythm of pulleys and hammers set the heartbeat of the building. For the workers, it was a life measured in hours, in revolutions of wheels, in the ache of joints that never fully healed. Every day brought a repetition as certain as the fog rolling from the Thames, every breath a negotiation between endurance and collapse, until ether arrived. It was first noticed in small, almost imperceptible ways. A man would drift in his movements, leaning against the workbench longer than usual. A woman would hum a tuneless song, lips twitching as if the rhythm were dictated by some invisible hand. The supervisors attributed it at first to fatigue, overwork, or poor ventilation. But the scent, sweet, icy, unsettling, lingered in corners, curling through the factory like a silent visitor. Samuel Hart, a young labourer in his 20s, was the first to surrender fully. He had been cautious, wary of anything that might dull his alertness on the looms, anything that might dull the precision his father had drilled into him since boyhood. Yet curiosity gnawed at him, as it gnaws at all those who walk the edges of propriety. A blue-labelled bottle appeared on the counter of the apothecary he passed daily, whispered about in the streets. It promised rest, relief, escape. One afternoon, when fatigue pressed his shoulders to the boards, Samuel took it. Only a single inhalation, he told himself. Only enough to steady his thoughts. The effect was immediate. The edges of the room blurred. The machinery's clatter softened into a distant echo. His own heartbeat slowed. His limbs felt lighter, almost buoyant, as though gravity itself had forgotten him. For the first time in months, Samuel's mind was unburdened. He forgot the heat, the dust, the constant ache in his back. He forgot the calluses forming on his hands. He even forgot the familiar faces of his co-workers, drifting past him as strangers. By evening, the effect had deepened. When asked by a foreman to double-check the alignment of gears, Samuel realized he could not recall the simple measure he had performed countless times. He squinted at the metal, fingers brushing against the pulleys, as though discovering them for the first time. When the foreman barked an instruction, Samuel's response was slow, delayed, uncertain. His own name seemed distant, something he had once carried with certainty, now like a title borrowed from someone else. "Samuel Hart, are you listening?" the foreman snapped, and Samuel blinked, startled by the sound of his own name on another's lips. He nodded, though his mind struggled to anchor itself. The world had become a fog more tangled than the city's winter mists, and the sweetness curling in his lungs tugged him further away from reality. By nightfall, Samuel stumbled home, limbs unsteady, brain heavy yet floating. He did not recognize his own reflection in the mirror above the mantel. He paused, staring at the features of a man he had known for decades, questioning whether he had ever truly been that person at all. The name Samuel Hart felt borrowed, like a story someone had told him, repeated enough to sound familiar, yet utterly distant. In the days that followed, Samuel returned to the factory with the same drifting disorientation. Tasks that once required focus now seemed impossible. Colleagues whispered, avoiding direct eye contact. Supervisors grumbled, noting the slackened pace, the occasional smile that appeared at inappropriate moments. Samuel smiled because he could not remember why it would be improper. He began to hide the cloth, taking small inhalations whenever the day's monotony pressed too heavily, whenever the aches reminded him he was flesh and blood. With each breath, he lost a fragment of himself. First, a memory of his morning routine, then the name of a neighbor, then the sequence of tools he had handled since boyhood. By the end of the week, Samuel Hart was present only in body, while mind and identity drifted along the chemical haze, wrapping the factory in its invisible, sweet clutch. By the time his foreman intervened, Samuel did not respond to his own name at all. London's fog carried the scent beyond factory walls. In alleyways, in homes, in taverns, the sweetness rose like a tide, pulling its inhabitants away from the world they had known, one inhale at a time, and Samuel Hart, labourer and brother, son and friend, had begun to vanish. Not in body, not in place, but in the very essence of who he was. In a city-breathing ether, it was the first and far from the last loss of identity. At the edge of Whitechapel, near a row of buildings long abandoned by pride and washed in soot, there existed a street that had begun to breathe differently. The air was thick with fog, yet it carried more than the usual winter damp. It carried a sweetness that slithered along the brickwork, pooling beneath shutters and through cracks in window frames. A faint, cold sharpness lingered in the breath of anyone who paused, curling into the lungs as if it belonged there, as though the city itself had begun inhaling a chemical dream. Mrs. Marlowe, a widow of modest means, had lived in one of the street's ground-floor flats for decades. Her windows had always been left open in summer to catch the breeze and shut tightly in winter to keep the cold at bay. But recently she had begun locking them with small iron latches, double bolts, and even an old chain she found in the corner of her cupboard. It was not the wind that frightened her, nor the strangers who occasionally passed through at night. It was the smell, the soft, insidious sweetness that crept in despite every precaution. She was not alone in her fears. Every household along the street had begun to mimic her precautions. Windows bolted, doors latched, shutters nailed where they could be. Yet the sweetness found its way in anyway, curling like smoke around corners, slipping beneath doors, and drifting along the ceilings with quiet persistence. It began with small effects. Children would pause mid-play, staring at the walls with glassy eyes, murmuring names of friends who were not present. Adults would linger near their windows, hands pressed to the sill, as though pressing back against some invisible tide. Laughter, soft and uneven, occasionally floated from the flats, muffled behind curtains. It was unsettling because it was familiar, a human sound twisted into dreamlike distortion. Mr. Tobias Keane, a carpenter living mid-street, had been the first to confront it directly. One evening he returned home to find his wife, Mary, seated rigidly on the edge of their bed, a faint glow from the street lamp outside illuminating her pale face. A handkerchief lay on the mattress, edges damp and curling. She blinked slowly at him. Her eyes were unfocused, yet soft, serene, like a child who had been soothed to sleep. "Mary?" he asked cautiously. She lifted the cloth with a trembling hand and inhaled, letting the sweet vapor drift upward. Her lips curved faintly, and she exhaled with a sigh that seemed to belong more to the street than to the room. I feel lighter," she murmured. "Everything. Easier." Tobias's chest tightened. He understood at once. The scent, the substance, had reached them again. The street's locked windows could not hold it back. The city was seeping into their home. By the following week, the effects became harder to ignore. Children wandered the hallways as if caught between waking and sleep. Men returned from work disoriented, hands fumbling as they removed boots and coats. Even the most cautious neighbors, those who barred their doors and chained their shutters, found themselves inhaling the sweetness that drifted through the walls, thick as fog, soft as a lullaby. Mrs. Marlowe began to hear whispers behind closed doors. Tenants murmured about bottles passed under coats, about handkerchiefs left carelessly, about the fog itself carrying promises of relief and forgetfulness. The street, once ordinary and grim, had become a gallery of drifting minds, where people paused mid-step to inhale, their faces slack, smiles faint, eyes bright with unfamiliar softness. By nightfall, the street was a tableau of suspended animation. Gas lamps flickered in the fog, casting wavering circles on the cobblestones. Curtains fluttered as if breathing. The scent swirled in invisible eddies, pressing against locked shutters, curling under doors, seeping through cracks. Windows remained bolted, yet the city found its way inside. Mrs. Marlowe pressed her palms to the glass and whispered a prayer she hoped would be heard. But the sweetness persisted. The street had learned to inhale, the city had learned to drift, and the residents, no matter how careful, had begun to forget the sharp edges of the world beyond their walls. London had claimed another corner of itself, and this street, with its locked windows, was no longer merely a street. It was a corridor into the drifting, a passageway into the chemical dream of the city itself. The House of Commons had never smelled sweet. Its oak panels carried centuries of ink, tobacco, and human sweat. The benches were polished by the elbows of men whose voices carried authority, ambition, and occasional malice. But that evening, as the fading light of spring bled through the tall windows, a subtle, almost imperceptible scent curled through the chamber, sweet, cold, unfamiliar. Ether. It drifted lightly, like an intruder no one quite recognized, yet immediately noticed. A blue-labeled bottle, smuggled from some distant laboratory or apothecary, had found its way into the hands of one of the clerks. Perhaps it had been used for calm nerves, perhaps curiosity, perhaps desperation. Regardless, the chemical had begun to weave itself into the air. Sir Edmund Cartwright, a man known for his fiery rhetoric and precise diction, was the first to falter. He rose to speak on the matter of industrial reform, a weighty subject with consequences for thousands of workers across London. But as he began, his voice trembled unexpectedly, the cadence softening, stretching unnaturally. He cleared his throat, pinched the bridge of his nose, and began again, only to find the words slipping away, as though the room itself were swallowing them. Across the chamber, other members noticed. Some whispered to their neighbors, some leaned back in their benches, frowning at the disorientation that touched even the most disciplined among them. One young MP, known for his meticulous note-taking, had dropped his quill, staring at the page as letters wavered and blurred. By the time the debate reached the heart of the industrial workers' conditions, the effect of ether was undeniable. A select few had inhaled more than a faint trace, perhaps unintentionally, perhaps seeking solace in the long hours and unrelenting pressures of governance. Their movements slowed, fingers tapped the benches in half measures, their eyes, once keen, softened in glazed contemplation. Sir Edmund's voice, meant to rally and persuade, became uneven. A phrase would stretch and linger. A point of law, once sharp, blurred. He tried to press on, calling attention to the plight of the labourers, but his own mind felt submerged under a fog he could neither lift nor ignore. The chamber's usual rhythm clatter of papers, the scrape of boots, the muttered objections seemed dulled, softened into a dreamlike cadence. In the gallery, clerks and scribes leaned forward, pens idle. The scent lingered here as well, drifting through the passages, curling past the chamber doors, brushing against the nape of the necks of visitors. Even the pages of prepared speeches seemed to weigh heavier in the hands of those attempting to read. Whispers grew. "Is Sir Edmund unwell? Has he been indulging?" The words, they falter. And yet the debate pressed on, mechanical in its persistence, even as clarity began to slip away from the men meant to embody it. The ether, subtle and unrelenting, was not dramatic. It did not announce itself with violence or alarm. It simply softened minds, stretched perceptions, and made the ordinary chaos of politics feel unnervingly slow, almost hypnotic. When the lamps were lit as dusk turned fully to evening, the chamber exhaled into the half-light. Sir Edmund stumbled to his seat, the end of his speech unspoken, the weight of authority dissipated like vapor. The MPs shuffled awkwardly, some trying to grasp the rhythm that had been lost, some glancing furtively at the clerks, their attention drifting toward the soft sweetness hanging in the chamber. Outside, fog thickened over the city, carrying its own chemical whisper along streets and alleys. Inside Parliament, clarity had faltered, authority had softened, and a subtle chaos settled over the chamber, a shadow of the fog and the sweetness that had begun to consume London from the smallest alleyways to the most august halls. That night, the House of Commons learned a small truth. Even the greatest minds, bound by law and tradition, could falter in the face of a sweetness that promised calm, yet delivered dissolution. And London, inhaling once again through the fog-laden streets, drifted quietly onward. The wards of St. Jude's Hospital had always been places of measured sighs, whispered prayers, and the steady rhythm of healing, or at least the pretense of it. The corridors were narrow, the walls lined with cold white tiles that reflected gaslight and illness alike. Nurses moved with quiet efficiency, doctors with precise concern, and patients with the fragile hope that sleep or medicine might dull the pain that gripped them. Yet that night, something had shifted, an unfamiliar weight pressed against the air, curling softly through hallways, seeping beneath doors, and lingering where it did not belong. Ether. It arrived unannounced, carried first in the breath of a young patient who had inhaled from a small blue-labeled cloth while awaiting a minor procedure. Then, imperceptibly, it seeped from one room to another, drifting like a ghost in the corridors. By the time the night shift began, it had claimed nearly every floor. The hospital smelled faintly sweet, oddly chilled, a chemical softness that undercut the metallic scent of disinfectant. In Ward B, Nurse Clara Whitby paused mid-step. She had carried trays of ointments and bandages all evening, guiding patients to their beds, soothing the frightened, and adjusting the blankets of those who shivered from fever. Now she noticed the odd stillness. The patients lay quieter than usual, not asleep, not merely resting, but suspended in a liminal state, their eyes half-lidded, their lips parted as if whispering to something unseen. Even the children, normally restless, were unnaturally calm, clutching dolls or hands with a mechanical gentleness. Clara frowned. "Too quiet," she muttered to herself. She adjusted a thermometer for a boy who had been feverish since afternoon. He blinked slowly, a faint smile ghosting his lips. When she gently pressed her hand against his shoulder, he shivered, but not from cold or pain. It was a tremor born of drifting, of a mind softened by chemical lull. Dr. Nathaniel Harrow, making his rounds, paused at the end of the corridor, hand on the rail. He was aware, of course, of ether's presence. He had been careful with it, measured it, controlled its use in his own practice, but here it had slipped beyond his control, flowing like water through the hospital's veins. The scent pressed against him with every step, tugging at the edges of attention, softening resolve. "Clara," he said quietly, voice tight, "check the patients in rooms 7 through 12. I fear the effects are spreading." The nurse nodded, moving carefully down the hall. Each door she opened revealed the same quiet abnormality. A woman whose lips moved in soft murmurs, a man whose hands twitched gently against the bedclothes, a child who stared into the corner of the ceiling as though it held an invisible window to another world. Some had inhaled deeply, others had caught only traces. The result, in every case, was disorientation softened to a dangerous calm. Even the infirmary's usual bustle had slowed, voices low, footsteps deliberate, time itself lengthening in slow, subtle waves. Dr. Harrow approached room 10. Inside, a labourer recovered from a minor fracture, normally restless and muttering, lay with limbs limp and eyes half closed. His hands twitched intermittently over the sheet. Harrow leaned closer, recognizing immediately what the ether had done. Dulled fear, dulled pain, dulled consciousness itself. He pressed a gentle hand to the man's arm. No response, save a soft exhale, a breath that seemed to carry both relief and quiet terror. The hospital, built to heal, had become a sanctuary for drifting minds. Rooms once filled with murmured prayers and careful breathing now held suspended figures, caught between consciousness and chemical suspension. The nurses moved silently, exchanging wary glances, knowing that the familiar boundaries of care had been softened, warped, and tested beyond their training. By midnight, the night hallways were lined with quiet rooms, the stillness broken only by the occasional soft sigh, a whimper, or the faint, drifting laughter of those who had inhaled too deeply. The gas lamps flickered, shadows stretching like fingers across the tiles, and the scent of ether curled through the air, curling into lungs, hearts, and thoughts alike. Dr. Harrow paused in the corridor, hands pressed to his temples. The hospital was too quiet, too soft, too sweet, and he realized with sinking dread that London's chemical haze had found a foothold even here, where life and consciousness should have been protected. The hospital had too many quiet rooms, and the city outside, inhaling ether from alleys and parlours, was only beginning to drift. The fog had settled over Suffolk like a thick, suffocating quilt, pressing into alleys and doorways, curling around the eaves of houses and the narrow stairwells of tenements. It carried with it a faint sweetness, a sharpness woven into the damp air, curling into the lungs of anyone unfortunate enough to pause too long. Mrs. Beatrice Calloway moved through the misted streets with quick, uneven steps, clutching the thin shawl around her shoulders. Her eyes were wide, frantic, scanning the shadows as though the night itself might hold her son. Her boy, Thomas, had been missing since dusk. He was supposed to be in bed, tucked beneath quilts in the small room he shared with two younger siblings. Yet when she returned home, the bed was empty, the window cracked open, and a faint, lingering sweetness caught her attention, a subtle, chemical trace that twisted her stomach. Ether. Beatrice's knees shook as she followed the scent down the street, along the alley where the laundry hung in damp folds, and rats scuttled unseen in the shadows. Every corner she turned, every step she took, carried her deeper into the fog, and the faint laughter of children echoed like distant bells, half mocked, half sweetened by the chemical haze drifting unseen through the city. "Tommy!" she called, voice tight with panic. "Thomas! Where are you, my boy?" Her voice was swallowed by the fog, the damp, thick air curling around it and carrying it back like a mocking echo. No response. Only the distant ripple of soft, uneven laughter, a sound familiar yet alien, as if a child were both present and not. She rounded the corner near Harrow Mill Alley and froze. There he was, slumped against the brick wall, eyes half closed, lips curling faintly as if in a dream, a handkerchief damp, glimmering clutched in his small fingers. Other children lingered nearby, equally entranced, faces slack, movements slow, drifting between wakefulness and sleep. The alley, long known for its dampness and shadow, now seemed suspended in some other dimension where time itself had softened and bent. Beatrice ran to him, clutching his shoulders. "Thomas! Oh, my child, wake, wake!" He blinked slowly, unfocused, yet the faintest smile remained on his lips. He tried to speak, but the words faltered, dissolving before they could form. The other children murmured softly among themselves, oblivious to the world outside the alley, to the mother whose panic burned bright in the foggy gloom. "Ether," Beatrice breathed, recognizing the scent immediately, sharp and sweet. It curled into her chest, warm and unwelcome, dragging memories of warnings and whispered fears into her mind. A small vial, blue-labeled, a handkerchief, a gift or a poison. She did not yet know which had drawn her son into this suspended haze. She pressed the boy to her chest, shivering herself as the fog brushed against her face. The sound of footsteps approached, slow, deliberate. Constable Rowan Briggs emerged from the shadows, lantern in hand, eyes narrow but sympathetic. He had seen this before. Children drifting in the chemical fog, parents desperate, families unraveling beneath the weight of a sweetness that dulled thought and blurred action. "Mother?" Thomas whispered, voice faint and distant, as if reaching through a dream. I feel soft." "Shh, darling," Beatrice murmured, rocking him gently. "It's all right. I've got you." Rowan moved closer. "Be careful, ma'am. Some have inhaled too deeply, too long, and it's not so easy to bring them back." Beatrice's breath caught. She had known that. Every story she had heard about the drifting alleyways, the parlor rooms, the secret handkerchiefs, it all converged here, in the soft weight of her son in her arms, the drifting haze curling through the fog, the sweetness that pressed against her lungs like an invisible hand. Thomas shivered faintly, but his eyes began to focus. Slowly, imperceptibly, the fog around him seemed to ease, as though her presence anchored him back to the world. Beatrice held him tighter, whispering prayers that rose soft and tremulous into the night, while the other children in the alley stirred, some waking, some still lost to the drifting. London's streets lay silent beyond the alley. Yet inside this pocket of fog, Beatrice realized something profound and terrifying. The city's children were no longer entirely theirs. Ether had crept into every corner, every home, every mind willing or unwilling to inhale its soft, dangerous promise. Tonight, she had found Thomas, but the fog remained. The sweetness lingered, and the city, she knew with a mother's aching certainty, would drift further with every breath. Bishopsgate had never been a quiet street. Merchants' carts rattled over uneven cobbles, hawkers shouted their wares, and the faint cries of the destitute lingered beneath the din of commerce. But on this spring night, the street bore an unease unlike any other, a tension drawn tight, coiling beneath the fog that pressed low from the river, and a sweetness that clung to every corner, every brick, every breath. Ether. The city had inhaled it in private parlors, in alleys, in the rooms of parents seeking quiet for their restless children. Now it had crept openly into the street, carried in damp coats, whispered among friends, drifting invisibly but unmistakably. It softened minds, dulled perception, and in its subtle pull turned fatigue and desperation into something dangerously combustible. It began with a disagreement, two men arguing over a bottle purchased earlier from the apothecary. Words grew heated, but not in the normal cadence of street quarrels. The syllables stretched unnaturally, voices draping over one another, tangled by distraction and the drifting sweetness that had begun to dull thought. One man shoved the other laughed, soft, airy, unhinged, and just like that, the spark ignited. From nearby doorways and alleyways, more men and women gathered, drawn by the sound. Some had already inhaled the chemical's promise earlier in the evening. Others, curious or alarmed, came closer. The fog carried laughter, shouts, and the soft, eerie murmur of voices that seemed to speak to themselves more than each other. It hung in the street, thick and insistent, weaving through the crowd like a subtle conductor. A cart tipped over near the corner, spilling barrels of ale across the cobbles. Those nearby slipped and staggered, hands raised in confusion. The scent of alcohol mixed with the chemical sweetness, and the scene wavered like a painting dissolving under steam. People began to push, shoving for space, unaware or unable to comprehend their own strength. Laughter erupted from some, cries of frustration from others, and the soft hum of drifting minds turned into a cacophony of erratic motion. Constables rushed into the street, but their shouts were muffled, their commands slowed by the haze that clouded perception. One officer grabbed a man by the collar only for the man to sway softly, as if floating, and slip from his grip entirely. Panic rippled through the assembled crowd. Hands clutched at faces. Others stumbled into the barricades of carts and crates, falling into heaps of laughter and confusion. At the center of the street, a small boy, no older than 10, had inhaled the cloth pressed into his hands by older cousins. He stumbled forward, giggling in soft, uneven bursts, barely aware of the chaos around him. Each inhale seemed to detach him further from reality. He waved a hand at passers-by, who were no longer watching. The fog carried the sound of his laughter and the chemical sweetness alike, rippling outward to those still yet to inhale. From the upper floors of nearby tenements, windows rattled as landlords called warnings. "Clear the street." Some shouted, though the words were carried off by the drifting air, lost in the mixture of fog, laughter, and chemical haze. Mothers peeked from shuttered windows, eyes wide with horror as they recognized the scene. Neighbors, children, workers, all caught in the invisible tide of ether-induced distraction and euphoria. By midnight, Bishopsgate had become a street suspended between worlds. Some lay on the cobbles, drifting in the chemical dream. Others stumbled blindly, hands reaching for support that wasn't there. Constables struggled to restore order. Hawkers abandoned carts. The fog pressed heavier, curling into alleys, spilling into adjacent streets. When the first lanterns flickered toward dawn, the riot began to ebb, not because the city had regained sense, but because exhaustion claimed those adrift in ether's grasp. Bodies slumped against walls. Hands loosened from grasping. Breaths returned to normal pace. Only the faint, lingering sweetness remained, crawling into corners, under doors, and into minds already attuned to its insidious presence. Bishopsgate would not forget this night. London would whisper of it, barely naming the cause. And the city, drifting through chemical haze, learned with its first riot that ether did not simply soften reality, it could ignite it. The shop on Bishopsgate had been in Mr. Horace Linton's family for generations, its narrow front packed with glass jars, polished brass scales, and carefully labelled apothecary bottles. It smelled of dried herbs, the faint sweetness of honeyed syrups, and the earthy tang of bark and roots collected from distant forests. For years, the shop had been a place of order, precision, and measured trade. Yet recently, it had become a crossroads for something far more dangerous, a blue-labelled liquid that promised relief, escape, and the soft erasure of worry. Ether. Horace had been reluctant at first. He had seen the rumours, heard the whispers, and yet he had obeyed a combination of curiosity and civic duty. People needed it, he told himself. Relief for the weary, the anxious, the restless. But the more he sold, the more he noticed the change, the distant glaze in eyes, the slackened posture, the faint smiles that flickered without reason. One evening, as the gas lamps of the street flickered against the fog-laden windows, Horace decided he could no longer participate in the quiet destruction of his neighbours. The shelves were lined with bottles too many. Each gleaming cobalt vial seemed to watch him, waiting. His hands trembled slightly as he unclasped the brass locks of the cabinet. "This stops tonight," he muttered to himself, voice rough from the day's arguments and the ever-present hum of machinery outside. He began to gather the bottles, one by one, setting them in a wooden crate intended for disposal or return to the apothecary warehouse. The first few were easy, smooth in their motion, heavy only with the weight of glass. But as he lifted the last row, he felt a tug not in his arms, but in his mind. A faint sweetness rose, curling around him like smoke, pressing against the inside of his skull. A whisper of relief, of warmth, of ease he had not yet earned. He shook his head and set the crate down. The effect persisted. The soft, cold scent wrapped itself around him, curling into his thoughts. His hands lingered on the bottle, fingers brushing the smooth glass. For a moment, he considered just one inhalation, just enough to steady himself, to feel calm as he finished the work. He knew that once inhaled, the world softened, the burdens dulled, the sharp edges smoothed. But the cost, he remembered the alleyways, the parlor rooms, the drifting children, the rioting streets, the quiet deaths. He could not justify it. A customer arrived, brass bell chiming, footsteps soft. Horace blinked, shaking himself. The man, a young clerk with ink-stained fingers, approached the counter. "Evening, Mr. Linton," the clerk said, glancing at the shelves. "I've come for the usual." Horace froze. His pulse quickened. The sweetness in the air had strengthened, teasing the edge of temptation. He knew the clerk relied upon the ether, sought it as a balm against fatigue, stress, the dull ache of labor that wore down his mind and body daily. And yet, Horace could not sell another bottle. "I'm afraid," he said carefully, "that I cannot provide it tonight." The clerk frowned, confusion flickering. "But everyone else—" "Yes," Horace said softly, almost pleading. "I know, but it cannot continue. Not like this." The man hesitated, then turned and left, without another word. The bell chimed faintly as the door closed. Horace exhaled slowly, leaning against the counter, feeling the soft pressure of ether's lingering scent like a hand on his chest. The crate sat heavy at his feet, filled with the evidence of both his conscience and his city's silent epidemic. Outside, fog drifted along Bishopsgate, thick and insistent, curling around the corners of buildings, slipping under doors, pressing into alleys. London breathed in and out, carrying the sweetness through its streets, into homes, into lungs already tuned to its soft promise. Horace understood, with a quiet ache, that the city had learned to crave it. He could deny them, resist, lock his doors, hide his bottles. But the fog and the allure it carried would find its way back, patient, unrelenting, and indifferent to the morality of any single merchant. He sank into the chair behind the counter, head in his hands, listening to the faint murmur of the street beyond. The night stretched, heavy, and he knew the city had inhaled too deeply to turn back. Winter arrived over London like a sigh long held, pressing frost against the narrow streets, threading ice along window panes, and frosting the cobbles with a pale, treacherous shine. The fog, relentless as ever, carried the same peculiar sweetness that had begun to haunt every corner of the city. A faint chemical edge woven through its icy breath, curling into the lungs of those who walked beneath gas lamps or through alleys where shadows gathered thickest. The residents of Lambeth, Southwark, and Whitechapel had grown accustomed to it, or perhaps they had no choice but to. Mothers whispered warnings to children who wandered too near the streets. Men shivered and shuffled past darkened doorways. And women in the parlor rooms of the city's wealthier districts inhaled from small handkerchiefs dipped in the blue-labeled ether, chasing rest or oblivion. Dreams had begun to change, subtly at first, and then with a strange intensity that unsettled everyone who noticed. It began with the workers returning from night shifts. They spoke quietly of visions that lingered long after the day had ended, factories that seemed suspended in the air, pulleys turning slowly as if underwater, machines that whispered names in voices they thought were their own, streets where the fog rolled in heavy waves and swallowed familiar buildings, leaving only shadows that flickered like candlelight. They laughed softly to themselves, unaware of their own voices, drifting between wakefulness and the half-sleep that ether now encouraged. At home, mothers noticed their children sleeping differently. Little Henry, curled beneath a quilt in the Calloway household, would murmur in dreams of floating along a river of mist, passing strangers whose faces were familiar yet impossibly distant. Tiny feet tapped against sheets, hands twitched in gentle patterns that made no sense. When awakened, the children spoke in soft, hushed tones, as though revealing secrets they did not yet understand themselves. Even the upper classes were not spared. Lady Evelyn Harwood, confined now to her estate following the scandal of her inhalations, wandered through her candlelit corridors at odd hours, speaking to empty rooms, eyes unfocused, her mind drifting between memory and dream. The scent of ether clung to her hair and clothing, wrapping the house in a quiet, pervasive sweetness. Servants whispered about the lady's strange behavior, but fear and fascination silenced any direct inquiry. In the city's hospital wards, Dr. Nathaniel Harrow noted the same phenomena. Patients inhaled ether for relief, but the nights were haunted by visions. Walls shifted imperceptibly, beds creaked under invisible weight, shadows moved independently of any light source. Nurses murmured of whispers in empty halls, and some patients would rise mid-sleep, wandering corridors with glassy eyes, speaking in riddles. The doctor's own nights were restless, plagued by dreams where he floated among machinery, fog, and the soft laughter of drifting patients, unable to wake. Even the streets themselves seemed alive. Harrowmill Alley, Bishopsgate, and other notorious corners carried a rhythm of dreamlike motion. Passers-by stumbled as if the cobbles themselves were bending, gas lamps pulsed faintly with their own heartbeat, and the fog seemed to whisper in 1,000 voices simultaneously. Shopkeepers awoke to find their windows slightly ajar, the faint scent of ether curling inside, even when no one had entered. Blue-labeled bottles appeared in doorways, left unnoticed, as if the city itself distributed them for the night. As the winter deepened, London collectively drifted. Dreams grew longer, visions more vivid. People awoke with lingering impressions of streets that moved, of faces that were not theirs, of voices that spoke truths they could not recall. The sweetness of ether threaded through the city's consciousness like a river beneath ice, unseen but impossible to resist. And in this quiet, pervasive haze, London learned something chilling. The winter was not merely cold. It was suspended in chemical slumber. It was a season where the city's dreams had become stranger than its waking life. In every home, every alley, every ward, the fog lingered, carrying its sweetness into lungs and minds alike. London slept, but not in the ordinary way. It slept beneath the influence of a dream that would stretch long after the frost had melted. Dr. Nathaniel Harrow had lived with secrets for longer than he cared to admit. He had walked the fog-laden streets of London, traced the alleys thick with drifting sweetness, and watched as the city inhaled its chemical haze, one breath at a time. He had seen children sway like reeds in a gentle wind, mothers crumble beneath invisible weight, workers drift from machine to machine as if they were spectres rather than men. He had observed families fractured by dependency, hospital wards softened into quiet, suspended moments, and parlours where laughter, airy and uncertain, replaced fear and grief. And he had stayed silent. Until tonight, the lecture hall at St. Bartholomew's had been closed for the evening, but the gas lamps outside shivered faintly against the creeping fog. Harrow walked through the deserted corridor, boots muted against the worn stone. He had called this meeting in secrecy, knowing the city's officials and prominent physicians would listen only if coaxed by urgency. The weight of months, perhaps years, pressed upon him, coiling in his chest like iron chains. The city was drifting into chemical oblivion, and still no one spoke its name. He entered the hall. Empty chairs waited like ghosts, each one echoing the absent presence of those who had succumbed, those who had inhaled the promise of relief, only to drift too far. He placed the blue-labeled bottle on the podium with deliberate care. its glass catching the flickering light, shimmering faintly like a beacon for the conscience he had long neglected. "Ether," he began, voice low, resonant, carrying the authority of one who had borne witness. "We have treated it as a novelty, as a tool, as a miracle, but London is learning otherwise. It is no longer confined to the operating table, the parlour, or the private alley. It flows through our streets, our homes, our hospitals. It bends the mind, softens the spirit, and steals the waking hours from those who inhale it." He paused, letting the words settle, though he was alone in the hall. Silence pressed in on him, punctuated only by the faint hiss of gas from lamps above and the distant echo of the fog settling outside. He could almost feel the city listening, suspended in a chemical haze, every breath laden with sweetness and danger. Harrow lifted the cloth from the podium, allowing the scent to rise faintly, sweet, cold, insidious. The chemical wrapped around him even here, and he inhaled only a fraction, feeling its pull-tug at the edges of thought. It was a reminder of the peril he had ignored for too long. "Look to the wards," he continued, voice rising, sharper now. "See the children who wander the hallways of their homes and schools, drifting between sleep and consciousness. See the labourers who stagger from machine to machine, too dulled to recognise themselves. Hear the laughter that rises in parlour rooms and alleyways, soft and haunting, where children and adults alike have inhaled their way into dangerous calm." He clenched his fists, a tremor of anger and exhaustion running through him. "We must speak openly. We must name the danger. The city is losing its minds to a substance we thought was controlled, safe, limited, but it is everywhere now. And every day it steals more than thought. It steals identity. It steals vigilance. It steals life." The fog pressed against the hall, slipping beneath windows, curling into the corners, carrying its chemical promise through the city, untamed and patient. Harrow's voice rose with urgency, as though projecting into the streets themselves. "We cannot remain silent. Hospitals, schools, homes, alleys, they are all conduits. And still the city drifts, soft, disoriented, unaware of the danger that seeps into every breath." He paused, chest heaving, voice cracking with the weight of truth long suppressed. In the quiet of the lecture hall, alone but determined, he named the epidemic aloud for the first time: ether. The city would not hear him, not tonight. The fog would carry only whispers and shadows. But somewhere, among those who would return in daylight to streets and hospitals, someone would listen. Someone would understand. Someone would begin to act. And for the first time in months, Dr. Harrow felt the faintest relief, not from the chemical, but from speaking the truth. Ether had claimed London, and at last someone had dared to speak its name. Detective Inspector Roderick Mallory had walked the streets of London for longer than he cared to count, tracing the underbelly of the city, following whispers, shadows, and rumours. He had investigated theft, assault, fraud, and worse, and he had grown accustomed to the scent of fear that lingered in alleys and lodging houses. But nothing he had encountered matched the insidious quiet that had settled over Bishopsgate and Whitechapel in recent months. The fog pressed heavy along the cobbles, thick and damp, curling around corners, hiding figures who seemed to drift rather than walk, and beneath it all was a scent, soft, sweet, impossible to ignore. Ether. The investigation began innocuously enough. Reports of children fainting in streets, of labourers collapsing mid-task, of merchants found swaying behind counters, lips twitching in strange, detached laughter. These incidents, dismissed at first as accidents, fatigue, or misadventure, had multiplied too quickly for coincidence. Mallory had been summoned to trace the cause, to determine whether malfeasance, poison, or negligence lay at the heart of the city's growing malaise. His first stop was an apothecary on Bishopsgate. The windows were fogged from within, the air curling faintly with chemical sweetness. A young assistant, pale and fidgeting, led him through narrow shelves, indicating a blue-labeled bottle resting on the counter. Mallory examined it, careful not to inhale too deeply. The label was simple, the liquid inside, clear, glinting like trapped frost. "Sir," the assistant murmured nervously, we sell it to those who request it. Only for nerves, only for pain. I swear we do not encourage more." Mallory noted the tremor in the boy's voice, the glazed look in his eyes, the faint sweetness clinging to the air. The shop had become both conduit and victim. He left with a faint sense of dread, the fog outside thickening as if to swallow him whole. Next, he traced reports to Harrowmill Alley. It was worse there. Children and adults alike were found wandering aimlessly, swaying softly as if guided by invisible hands. Some clutched small handkerchiefs damp with the chemical, others laughed faintly at nothing. Mallory recorded every detail, but the sensation of unreality pressed against him, threatening to dull the clarity he relied upon. The alley seemed suspended in a dream, time stretching unnaturally, and every breath he took carried the sweetness further into his own lungs. Finally, Mallory visited the hospitals, where wards had become quiet chambers of drifting consciousness. Nurses whispered, unable to describe the effects in words that would satisfy authority. Patients slept with eyes half open, murmuring, twitching, caught between life and chemical-induced oblivion. Children inhaled from small blue-labeled cloths. Laborers inhaled to forget fatigue. Mothers inhaled to calm crying infants. The hospital, designed to preserve life, had become a vessel for suspension and drift. Mallory's journal began to fill with sketches, observations, and patterns. The spread was systematic yet invisible, flowing along streets, through homes, into parlors, alleys, and even offices. The fog of ether had infiltrated every layer of the city: homes, hospitals, factories, parlors, boarding houses, even drawing rooms where wealth and propriety had once held sway. No one, it seemed, could resist. By midnight, the detective sat in his office, lamp flickering, the city outside lost beneath rolling fog. He had found too much. Every district touched, every social class reached, every corner of London influenced by the same soft, chemical hand. Even those who believed themselves immune landlords, magistrates, physicians, mothers, had been compromised. The scale of the epidemic was staggering, the subtlety of the chemicals' reach terrifying. Mallory wrote his final note for the night. London has inhaled deeply. The city drifts. The fog carries sweetness through every street, every house, every mind. This is not a crime confined to a few. It is everywhere. Too widespread to contain, too subtle to arrest. And as he closed his notebook, the faint, sweet scent of ether pressed against the office window, curling around him, reminding him that even now the city continued to inhale. Beneath the cheerful façades of Covent Garden, behind a nondescript flower shop, the hidden cellar had thrived for months. Known only to a few, it had become a refuge for those seeking escape, a sanctuary where the city's hierarchy and laborers, children and widows, gentlemen and seamstresses alike, could drift into the soft embrace of ether. The air was always thick with its subtle sweetness, cold and sharp at once, curling into lungs like smoke, softening thought, loosening boundaries. Tonight, however, the cellar carried a different tension. The occupants sensed it, though none could articulate the danger that pressed against them. Word had begun to circulate of raids, of inspectors prowling through alleys, of parents demanding answers for children lost in the chemical haze. Even the fog that crept down from the Thames seemed sharper, heavier, as though it carried both warning and expectation. Silas, the unofficial host of the cellar, moved quietly among the patrons, a tall figure in shadowed coat, eyes glinting with both knowledge and wariness. He had guided the nightly gatherings for months, careful to maintain secrecy, careful to preserve the fragile balance between indulgence and ruin. But even he felt the night's unease pressing against the walls, twisting the familiar sweetness into something more urgent. At the far end of the cellar, Miss Clara Astley reclined in the dim glow of a lantern. Her fingers trembled slightly as she inhaled the familiar ether from a small, blue-labeled cloth. The softness it brought, weightless, serene, disorienting, had become a secret she relied upon. The laughter that drifted from the other corners of the cellar felt distant tonight, echoing faintly through walls, as if the city itself had begun to listen. A faint knock echoed above the floorboards. The door rattled. Silas paused, stiffening. Patrons glanced toward the ceiling, blinking through the chemical fog that blurred perception. Someone whispered. The knock came again, louder this time. Footsteps followed, heavy, deliberate, and distinct from the usual sounds of commerce or street patrol. Panic rippled through the cellar. Patrons who had once leaned into the floating calm of ether now trembled. Children clutched the sides of benches. Adults gripped their handkerchiefs like talismans. The air, already saturated with sweetness, thickened with tension. Silas moved toward the stairs, careful not to alert the patrons more than necessary. He unlocked a side exit, just as constables' voices called from above, muffled but insistent. Orders shouted in the fog. "Open the doors! Everyone out!" The chemical haze seemed to tangle thought, slow reaction, and yet panic sharpened instinct where reason had dulled it. Clara stirred, blinking through the fog that hovered like a second skin. She felt the urgency in Silas's movements, the subtle tightening of the room's energy. For a moment, fear mingled with the floating calm ether provided, creating a vertigo that left her uncertain where serenity ended and danger began. Patrons were guided carefully toward the stairs. Some resisted, their minds too softened to grasp the reality of the raid. Laughter, soft and lingering, turned to stifled gasps. Then silence. Hands clutched walls, railings, and each other as Silas ushered them into the street above. The fog outside was thick, cold and biting, carrying the faint chemical sweetness along with it, spreading into alleys, wrapping around those waiting beyond the shop. When the last patron had escaped into the obscured night, Silas returned to the cellar. It was empty. The air, once warm with the drifting chemical haze, felt colder, heavier. Blue-labeled bottles, cloths, and small remnants of indulgence lay abandoned on tables, glowing faintly in the lantern light. The cellar had breathed its last that night, its secret revealed, its sanctuary shuttered by authority and consequence. Silas stood in the center of the room, hands clasped, eyes scanning the familiar walls, now emptied of all life except memory. The soft, sweet scent lingered faintly, clinging to corners, as if the cellar itself exhaled in sorrow. London had claimed the street above. The hidden cellar had surrendered, and the city, drifting under fog and chemical haze alike, would remember the nights of quiet indulgence, when laughter was suspended, breath was sweetened, and the allure of escape had been palpable, yet fleeting. By late spring, the fog that rolled from the Thames no longer confined itself to streets, alleys, and markets. It had grown restless, creeping higher into London, curling around spires and arches, pressing against windows and chimneys, slipping beneath shutters and doors with imperceptible persistence. And with it, the scent faint, sweet, impossibly cold followed, softening minds and tugging at the edges of thought wherever it reached. The House of Commons, centuries old and imposing, was not immune. Its high ceilings and echoing halls, meant to inspire clarity and precision, now bore the first hints of an unfamiliar intrusion. The chamber smelled subtly different, not of ink and polish alone, but of a quiet, chemical sweetness curling along the beams, seeping beneath doors, lingering in the corners of benches where MPs adjusted papers and notes. Ether had arrived, carried invisibly by the fog that pressed against the city. Inside, the debate had begun on the regulation of labour and industry. Sir Edmund Cartwright, still recovering from his last inhalation and hesitant, adjusted his papers with hands that trembled faintly. Even the most meticulous MPs, accustomed to long sessions and rigid schedules, found themselves distracted. Words slurred slightly, pauses lingered too long, and gestures faltered, all softened by the subtle chemical presence in the air. Constable Rowan Briggs, stationed discreetly near a side entrance, noticed it immediately. The chamber's atmosphere carried the same sweet, sharp, drifting quality he had come to recognize on the streets, in alleys, and among drifting children. Eyes that should have been alert were glassy, attention wavering, the rhythm of the debate slowed by a force no one could touch, but everyone inhaled. Sir Edmund cleared his throat, attempting authority. "I remind the House that the welfare of the city's labourers is paramount." His words stretched unnaturally, caught in the chemical haze. He raised his hand for emphasis. It trembled slightly, uncharacteristic for the man who had once commanded chambers with precision. The MPs shifted, glancing at one another, muttering quietly. Their usual cadence, a steady march of argument and rebuttal, was dissolving into pauses, drifts, half-formed thoughts. A young MP near the back, normally precise and observant, began scribbling nonsense across his notes, pen moving lazily across the page. Another leaned against his bench, eyes glassy, nodding faintly to arguments he barely processed. One by one, the fog worked its quiet mischief, softening minds trained in law, governance, and debate. Rowan moved cautiously among the galleries, noting the unnatural stillness of the attendants, the softened reactions of the clerks taking notes. The chamber, normally a place of discipline and order, had become a room suspended, caught between attention and drift. Some MPs murmured to themselves, repeating fragments of arguments that had already passed, their voices lighter, softer, detached from urgency. The sweet chemical scent seemed to coil around their minds, pulling clarity just out of reach. The speaker attempted to regain control, gavel raised, calling for attention. "Order, gentlemen!" Yet the sound came unevenly, muffled somehow by the fog that infiltrated walls, benches, and lungs alike. Men shifted, eyes unfocused, hands drifting toward documents and leaving them again. Laughter soft, dreamlike, dissonant escaped from a corner where a few MPs murmured privately, unaware they were audible to all. By dusk, the chamber was a quiet storm of inefficiency. Papers lay scattered, arguments faded into soft murmurings, and the decision-making that London relied upon seemed suspended. Ether, invisible but insistent, had claimed its territory. The fog pressed against windows with persistence, curling through the upper galleries, touching minds trained to govern a city that no longer fully breathed the same. Outside, the river carried the fog onward, spreading it to streets yet untouched, ensuring that London would inhale again, drifting further into the chemical haze. Inside, the House of Commons was left with a sobering realization. Authority was fragile, even here, even among those sworn to uphold it. When the city itself breathed sweetness into its chambers, softening the edge of reason, one inhalation at a time, London had found its master, the fog, and ether was its hand. The dawn broke quietly over London, though quietly had come to mean something different in these weeks. The fog lingered low over the cobbles, curling into alleys, threading along riverbanks, and pressing against the shutters of homes and shops. Gas lamps, their flames flickering as though unsure of purpose, threw halos into the mist. The city awoke, but not fully. It stirred like a body roused from sleep, yet still trapped in dream. Consciousness softened and slow. Ether had touched it everywhere, leaving its mark in every breath, every pulse, every hesitant step. In the narrow alleys of Whitechapel, labourers moved sluggishly toward their day's work, hands trembling with disuse, muscles slack. Faces once sharp with the edge of survival were now softened, almost ethereal, the pupils slightly dilated, the expressions distant. Children who had once run, shouted, and tumbled in streets now lingered along walls, eyes half-lidded, as if the sweetness had seeped into their very bones. Parents looked on with fear, frustration, or resignation, unable to rouse their wards fully from the chemical haze that had stolen vigor and clarity. In the hospital wards of St. Jude's, the nurses moved with uncanny patience. Patients lay still in their beds, breathing shallowly, murmuring faintly to themselves, caught in a liminal state that hovered between life and the drifting calm ether offered. Dr. Nathaniel Harrow, weary beyond comprehension, moved from bedside to bedside, checking pulses, adjusting linens, and marking observations in his ledger. Even he felt the subtle tug at his own mind, an almost imperceptible desire to inhale, to drift just a little. He shook it away, focusing on the ward, on the fragile lives suspended under his care. In the parlour rooms of the wealthy, Lady Eveline Harwood sat draped in silken cushions, the blue-labelled bottle resting nearby. Her eyes were unfocused, but she smiled faintly as she traced the lace of her gloves, drifting between memory and chemical-induced calm. Servants moved quietly, adjusting curtains, lighting lamps, delivering breakfast, all the while breathing in the faint sweetness that lingered, carrying with it a soft disorientation that pervaded even the most controlled households. On Bishopsgate, the merchants who had attempted to resist found their resolve faltering. The crates and bottles in their shops gleamed faintly under the rising sun, the chemical sweetness pressing against their thoughts. Even those who tried to close their windows and lock their doors felt the fog curling around the building, slipping beneath every crack and seam, carrying its influence into their lungs. Customers trickled in, eager for relief from fatigue, anxiety, and the relentless pressure of the city. The merchants sold what they could no longer deny, knowing full well the toll it exacted. Parliament, now awake and unsteady, carried its own residue of the fog. MPs, clerks, and attendants moved slowly, voices soft, thoughts dulled by the lingering sweetness of the ether that had infiltrated their chambers the night before. Sir Edmund Cartwright, still at his desk, blinked repeatedly, trying to gather focus, but each inhalation of the residual fog seemed to pull clarity further away. Decisions delayed, arguments dulled. London's governance drifted along a gentle, chemical current. By mid-morning, the city as a whole had taken on a strange, floating rhythm. Horses walked with an unusual hesitation. Hawkers moved like figures in a half-remembered dream. Even the Thames, swollen with the tides and morning mist, seemed to ripple with an otherworldly slowness. London, that sprawling, bustling metropolis, had become a city, suspended, its heartbeat softened, its thoughts dulled, its will diffused. And in the quiet corners, alleys, drawing rooms, hospitals, boarding houses, the people who had inhaled felt it most. The world was lighter, pain was softened, memory flickered, time itself felt less urgent. Dr. Harrow, standing in the fog-laden courtyard of St. Jude's, watched the city inhale once more. He knew the morning would pass. He knew the streets would grow crowded, the alleys noisy again. But he also knew something far more troubling. The drift had begun, and London would not return fully to itself. Not yet. Not for many weeks, perhaps months. Each breath taken by the city carried the trace of sweetness, the tug of weightless calm, the subtle invitation to forget. For the first time in years, London awoke not entirely awake, and the fog, soft and insistent, pressed on, curling between streets, homes, and minds alike. The city had drifted, and for now there was no anchor strong enough to bring it back.